details, and we do have a tight schedule today, so we don't want to get carried away, but I think it's important for us to get a better understanding. And I'd also like that we've had some preliminary biographical data on each of the members, but the staff would like you to review that and upgrade it as you see fit. So very briefly, once again, I'm Woody Hunt. My, I guess, experience, and I'm from El Paso. I'm chairman of Hunt Companies, which is a firm that develops, invests, and manages real property. We have 1,300 employees that are scattered across the United States in 15 different offices. But my relevance to this committee and our job that we have ahead of us is I was a UT Board of Regents and a vice chair from 1999 to 2005. I led the long-range planning committee at UT and for our 2000 report, which was done almost simultaneously with closing the gaps that came out of the coordinating board, and was also heavily influenced by Steve Murdoch, who will hear demographic data. I also, at the Governor's Business Council, supervised Leading the Way report, which was a call for Texas to move toward national, international benchmarking and incentives in our funding of higher education. And then probably most importantly and relevant to here was in 2009, I served as chair of the Select Commission on Higher Education and Global Competitiveness, which was a 15-member commission appointed by the governor, lieutenant governor, and the speaker. I've also more recently served on both the Cost Efficiency Committee and the Continuous Improvement Committee, which have led up to this committee, and we'll hear a report from me on one of those later today. So that was too long, but I will listen if we can start on my left-hand side here and come around. Thank you.
I'm Shirley Richardson. You probably remember Shirley.
I remember Shirley. Glad to see you.
And thank God for Mary Kay in the Commissioner's office. She's been on the phone with me for about an hour. The roads are safe. I've been driving around right in this vicinity for about 8:30. But I'm challenged. Boy, can you? I'm the fire superintendent from Boyd Park ISD School District along the East Harris County, and former commission education of 2004. Love working with my and all the wonderful folks here.
Thing board. Sorry. Oh.
Good morning. I'm Ramon Dovalina. I'm retired from the presidency of Laredo Community College. Been serving in community colleges administration for 35 years. The bio that had been sent out said I was at Alamo. I was at the other ACC. I was at Austin Community College.
Gotta
So
turn
we
you
need
on.
to get that one corrected.
Ramon, I gotta turn you on.
Oh,
now
do I have to say it all again?
If the little red light comes on, you're on, and when you're off, you can turn it off.
All right. I'm Ramon Dovalina, former president at Laredo Community College. I was there for 12 years. I was at Austin Community College, which is the other ACC. The bio says I was at Alamo. I was not at Alamo. And also worked at Del Mar at the very beginning of my career. So I've been in community college administration for 36 years. And I've been retired now for 7 years. So glad to be here.
And I'm Jerry Massey, and I currently live in Richmond, Texas, but we just recently moved from Pittsburgh, Texas, where I was a member of the board of the Northeast Texas Community College. I was on that board for 18 years and was chair for 6. In addition, I've also been on the advisory board of the Texas A&M University School of Rural Public Health. It's in the Health Science Center, now it's part of the A&M system. And many, many years ago, I tried to teach healthcare economics to doctors at the University of Texas Medical Branch, which was an interesting gig there. But thank you.
I'm Kathy O'Briody Green from San Antonio, recently retired from an engineering, construction, and industrial service company, Zachary, former member of the Texas Court. You can't hear me? Well, that's a first, Susan. I promised Susan and David that I would be very quiet, and Woody, I would never admit in public that Steve Murdoch influenced me, okay? That gets you into trouble. I also had the opportunity to chair the College for Texans Foundation, which is the philanthropy friend of the coordinating board. And I will tell you that I think some of the greatest staff anywhere in Texas are the professional staff and their support staff that live and work and pretty much live in this building. So it's great to see all of you who always motivate me to do better.
I'm D. Margot, not Donald, but D. Margot from El Paso, Texas. I formerly served in the state legislature as a member of the House of Representatives. I'm the former CEO of an insurance brokerage firm that sold in 2012. And right now I've been appointed to the Board of Managers for the El Paso Independent School District. We've gone through some challenges recently. Most notable is that our former superintendent is behind bars. And so I am president of the 5-person Board of Managers appointed by Michael Williams.
My name is Wright Lassiter. I'm from Dallas, Texas. This is my 5th day of freedom. I have retired as the chancellor for the Dallas County Community College system. And they call me Chancellor Emeritus now. We exceeded our targets for closing the gaps during my tenure as chancellor. So I was very anxious to serve on this panel to see where we go next. I've been in community college administration for 33 years, 20 of those years in the Dallas district, the last 8 as the chancellor.
Lord, can I say something? I also forgot to add that my wife served on the higher ed coordinating board, Adair. Some of you may know her. She was with Kathy, and she was one of the authors of the Closing the Gaps report.
It's good that you remembered that.
Yes, I do. It's important.
Yes. Good morning. My name is Laurie Bricker, and I am a former member of the Higher Ed Coordinating Board. I chaired the Participation and Success Committee for a few years. I am an educator by background and my past, but currently I've been for the past 7 years an investment banker with Jefferies, and my clients are ISDs and higher ed. I'm also a former president of the Houston ISD board. I think that's when Shirley and I started getting together and getting into trouble. So I found it ironic that the two of us are sitting at this table. I also was one of the creators of what is now called All Kids Alliance, which was Houston's initial P16 efforts. And thanks to Dean Wimpelberg at the University of Houston, he's really kicked it up many notches. So I'm extremely excited to be back here, back home again, and I look forward to our work together.
My name is Doug Hodo. I'm bipolar. I've worked in the public sector of higher education and the private sector of higher education. And I remember she rides a Harley.
That's right. I do.
But it's really exciting to be here because one of my passions, even after 7.5 years of retirement, is how do we help young people find out who they are and what they're going to do sooner. And I think that's one of the real challenges in life, financially as well as from a value point of view. So I'm thrilled to be here.
I'm Larry Faulkner. I'm former president of the University of Texas at Austin and a former president of Houston Endowment. I've spent a long career in higher education, which started, in fact, almost 50 years ago. I've seen a lot. Most of it in the public sector in Illinois and in Texas. I've been retired for the last 2 years. However, I'm spending a lot of time on boards of various organizations, 3 university boards, 3 foundation boards, and several nonprofit boards, some of which have educational implication.
Jim Anderson. I got started in education at the Air Force Academy as a faculty member, and from there became a trustee at the Air University. and I am a recently retired chancellor of Central Texas College, having been there for 25 years as the chancellor.
I'm Jerry Turner. I'm a lawyer by training and by practice. I served on the Texas Tech Board from 2007 to 2013. My third and fourth year, I was served as vice chairman. My last 2 years, I served as chairman. I serve on a couple of foundation boards, some of which manage money for universities, and I spend a lot of money on my kids' tuition, so I'm really interested in higher education.
I'm Lionel Sosa from San Antonio, and when you hear Steve Murdoch's presentation for the first time or second time or third time or 10th time, you are kind of reminded of the need of higher education in Texas, especially for the poor kids and the families who never even thought of going to college. And of course, these are the people that we are honing in on. These are the people that we need to understand better, that we need to understand their families better. And I've served on the board of trustees of the University of the Incarnate Word in San Antonio for 8 years, and at the Texas A&M University System Board of Regents for 6 years between 2000 and 2006. And I see the great work that the coordinating board is doing with Gentex and closing the gaps. And I think planning for the next step is just so critically important to all of us. I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm James Dickerson. I live in New Braunfels. I'm a former member of the SFA, Stephen F. Austin University Board of Regents. I am retired from Dow Chemical Company. I worked in research for about 10 years. Decided I didn't want to do that the rest of my life. Went back to law school and became an intellectual property attorney for Dow. So I spent my next 26 years doing that. Retired in 2005, moved to New Braunfels from Lake Jackson, which is south of Houston. I volunteer with Habitat for Humanity. In Lake Jackson, we volunteered at the high school, my wife and I, with dealing with at-risk children. We try to keep them in school. I've been on the New Braunfels Library Board, the City Ethics Commission, but now I think my most important jobs is my wife and I both are volunteers at Baranoff Elementary School in Austin and at Bailey Middle School in Austin, so where our two granddaughters go to school. So, and I'm really excited. I'm starting with a clean slate, so all of you and the other folks are going to need to educate me fully, which I'm sure you will do, but having read the background materials, I really do have a lot of questions, and I think it's going to be a really great committee assignment. Thank you for including me on this.
Great. I'm Bernie Francis. I live in a Dallas suburb of Carrollton. I've been there forever, and I own a couple businesses. One is technical and professional staffing. The other is a caregiving business or assisted living at home. And I've chaired 2 boards of regents, the Texas State University System. I think that's about the 3rd largest university in Texas. I'm not sure. And my more favorite, believe it or not, was the Texas State Technical College, which is the only outcomes-based, 100% outcomes-based funding post-secondary school in Texas, right? Is that true? Thank you. Okay, that holds that distinction. Let's see. I've shadowed Woody quite a bit in education reform, et cetera. I serve on what used to be the Governor's Business Council. This is Texas Business Council now, and I co-chair with Woody the K-16 task force there. And he and I have also been on the select committee that he talked about and the cost efficiency committee that he talked about.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to point out it's important to turn on your microphone because it's not really because of this room, but because we're being webcast. And every meeting will be, and the meetings will be recorded, and so those individuals who are not able to be available this day can watch the meeting later, and individuals who, even some of you at some time might not be able to attend the meeting, you'll be able to watch the webcast. So that's the reason for that. I'd just like to say briefly, the commissioner was not able to be here because of a family emergency, and he plans on being here in the future, and so we hope things go well. And the three of us here were at the first Closing the Gaps. We worked with Closing the Gaps, and so we're hopeful that this committee actually exceeds the efforts of the previous plan, which I think was unusual in that it actually has lasted almost 15 years now, and people know about it, in fact, across the country. It was not perfect, but I think it was very good. I think really have hopes that you guys will be able to take it to another level, and we really appreciate all of you taking the time to be here because this is important. Now, because we're the coordinating board, any committee we put together, we cannot appoint the chair. We have a presiding chair, and Mr. Hunt has graciously agreed to be the presiding chair today. I don't think he would object to continuing, but this is an open process, and it's important now that as presiding chair, Mr. Hunt accept first nominations to be chair, and then all of you need to vote on that, and then once that's done, we need to follow up with nominations and election for a vice chair. And then following that, I can go into details about how the basic structure of the committee and how we're anticipating it would work. Are you comfortable with that, Mr. Hunt?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if now you can call
I'd just like to open it up to the committee for discussions, and hopefully those discussions will lead to a nomination that we can vote on as a committee.
Woody, would you agree to serve as chairman?
If nominated, Jerry, I would agree to serve.
I nominate Woody Hunt as chair.
Second.
Any opposition? Please. If none, the nomination is passed and graciously accepted. I look forward to serving on this as the chair. I do think this committee is extremely important. I think the issue that we have before us is essentially the future of the state, or the future of the state in terms of the quality of life that we have experienced, and it's a very daunting challenge. It's one I've looked at for now over 15 years. Our progress, I think, closing the gaps in 2000, was at the leading edge and directly identifying the problem of how do we have outcome completions that between different racial and ethnic groups that are much closer together than what we have historically experienced or what we have right today. And that was right. The implementation since then. I mean, the truth is that we're in a race between two mathematical formulas. One is a demographic, which we're going to hear from Steve Murdoch about. That is, we know what that's going to be, and the changes there from his forecast will be very small over time. So we know what that outcome is. The variable that we have some hope of intervening on is, once again, the closing the gap between outcomes of different ethnic and racial groups. And the truth is we are losing that race. Since closing the gaps in 2000, the demographic change has been faster than our ability to close the gap on the educational side. We have to have programs that will lead to reverse of that. In other words, where we're able to close the gap faster than our demography is changing. If we do not do that, we'll continue on the trend of where we are today, which is a workforce which drives our quality of life, our income, our ability to support all of our programs, including education, that is in a relative decline, not both an absolute decline and a relative decline. But I don't want to get in a long. We can have that discussion later. So with that, I would like to take a second step here. David mentioned to me this late last week, and so I immediately began to think, well, who can serve as a co-chair? We need some leadership to to essentially support my leadership and to substitute when if necessary. I went over the list, and I served on the UT board, as I said earlier, from 99 to 2005, which was the same time Dr. Faulkner was the president of UT Austin. So I got to know him during that period of time. But what I would like to suggest for your consideration is his nomination and election as co-chair. And it's not because he and I think the same. It's because I learned during that period of time that we came from two different backgrounds, and while often we could get to conclusions and build a consensus, it was not without tension, and I thought that was appropriate for this committee. I thought he well represented the academy and the educational institutions of the state. Also represents the nonprofit leaders of the state. Houston Endowment really played that role within the state when he was there. So I think it's not because we have a previous relationship in a previous time. Well, it is in that sense, because I do know, once again, that he will be a very good representation of the institutions, which are very important in my view as the means to the end. The means being how are we going to get there, and the end being closing this gap. We can't do it without the institutions. So with that, I would like the committee to consider or entertain a motion on a co-chair.
I'll second that, Woody.
Okay, made and seconded, and any opposed? If not, I would welcome Larry as a partner on this, and any comments that you'd like to make. Larry I told him a few minutes ago that if this went this way, he was very, very gracious to say that he would be supportive. But go ahead and make your comments.
Well, I just want to thank you all for the confidence that your action represents, and Woody's nice comments. I think how he summarized it is, I think, accurate. But, Mr. Chairman, before we go further, I think probably in the interest of truth in packaging, I should declare that I am currently a member of the SMU Board of Trustees. I'm not sure that that's known to the staff. I don't think it makes a difference, but maybe we should be sure about that.
David?
If we understand a recommendation for $100 million for SMU, we will tell you that it's problematic.
Okay. All right. So we now have our leadership in place, and hopefully we'll meet your expectations, and certainly I know we'll both endeavor to do so. I'm going to give you a few prepared remarks, and then we'll hopefully try to get to Steve Murdoch and get back on schedule. As you know, our committee is charged with providing to the coordinating board advice and recommendations regarding the board's development of the next long-term strategic plan for Texas higher education. And what that really means is we're going to do all the work, and with the support of the staff and perhaps external consultants, and that'll be decided later. But the final decision obviously rests with the coordinating board on the final report that's to be issued. So we need to. I mean, we're in an advice role, and we're not the final authors of the report in an official way. And as you'll see from the agenda, to help us begin our work, we'll begin getting updates today on population changes in Texas and where we are with our progress toward meeting the goals of our current Texas higher education plan, closing the gaps by 2015. You will also hear today, even though the coordinating board remains focused on the 4 goals of closing the gaps, it already has started looking beyond closing the gaps, that's us, to a long-range leadership vision for 2030 in order to make Texas not only competitive nationally but internationally. For example, I will be providing, with staff's assistance, an overview of the work of the Council for Continuous Improvement and Innovation in Texas Higher Education. Formation of that council, chaired by Fred Heldenfels, who was the chair of the coordinating board at the time, was the result of a long-range recommendation from the 2010 Cost Efficiencies Report to the governor, which came out of the effort of the Advisory Council for Higher Education Cost Efficiencies as a mechanism for promoting and institutionalizing efficiencies. Our discussions today will involve where we want to be as a state by 2030, and how higher education should contribute to where we want to be. While we are talking and listening, please give some thought how the 5, 10, and 15-year needs of the state will identify for us what can be better addressed by state government and by our higher education institutions and programs. And with that, I'm going to turn the meeting over to Deputy Commissioner David Gardner, and which we've already done that, and now we will go to Steve Murdoch. Yes, David.
I first need to at least update you on the type of plan that the board would like you to have. I'll try to do that very quickly as we're a little bit behind schedule. But as it's not the same as all plans developed, we'd just like to review that with you. Very quickly, you've already heard that you will be making a recommendation to the coordinating board. Now, I have to say, if there are any differences between the committee and what the board would like to recommend, that this committee has direct access to the board and will in fact present its recommendation to the board. So if the commissioner or anyone would have any differences, that would be discussed in public with the board. But we anticipate that it's likely that whatever this committee recommends is the plan will be taken forward in that state. I think it's also important to note that the coordinating board just went through the sunset process, and that committee reaffirmed the board's role in terms of doing the statewide planning for higher education. So this fits directly into that. So that's one area that the legislature still recognizes as critical for one body to look across systems, across sectors to produce that type of plan. In terms of the plan, the board has decided they'd like to develop a similar type of plan. That is, what are the most important goals for the state by 2030? You could choose a different year if you wanted, but we think 15 years is about as far out as is really legitimate to address. That we think of the state goals as results. This board, and we believe it's very important to have something measurable so you know whether you've actually achieved your goals or not. That in terms of strategies, that you only include the most promising strategies. In other words, this isn't a plan to tell everybody what to do. To remind some of you, you'll hear later that one of the most important strategies that came out of the last plan was the recommended high school program as a default curriculum in the state. There were some others, such as the universities being able to keep all their overhead income from research, which they had not been able to do previously. But there were just really about 10 strategies distributed through the plan. That there be some system to ensure progress. Mainly, we pay attention to what's happening, know whether we're moving in the right direction. So, some of you will know that given some of Steve Murdoch's new population projections, we modified the first goal of the plan from increasing by 500,000 students more to 630,000 students, because we knew we wouldn't really achieve our goals. There were a number of things within the plan that were modified as we went along to address current circumstances. So you essentially develop an easy plan, and one that's easy to remember. You shouldn't have to go and pull out a 600-page document and try to figure out what it was about. So that leads to a concise and focused plan. 2 to 5 goals is what we're anticipating. Measurable targets, broad strategies, responsive to statewide needs, responsive to regional needs, and stimulates creativity and adaptability. I was mentioning to some of you earlier that while we talk about graduation rates a great deal at the coordinating board, we didn't mention graduation rates in the plan. We talked about success. The idea was graduation rates tell people specifically really how to achieve success. We thought there were many ways. So we wanted to get students back into school. There's a whole range of things. And we've already achieved, you'll hear later, our success targets because of that. But at the same time, graduation rates went up across the state in a significant kind of way. Even though we didn't ask that, we don't know exactly how the schools did it because it was left to their own devices. It's very significant, especially during a time where anyone knows, at least based on the research, that because we had more and more poor students, more and more first-time college students, we were actually to move up in terms of graduation rates was really a great achievement, though we're still not really where we need to be at this point. And you'll hear a lot more about that from Steve. This next is simply we need to distribute this to everyone. This cannot be a plan for the state to most people don't agree with it. In some ways, people could say the last success was with the Closing the Gaps as we got in front of the band. There were things everyone agreed the state needed to do, but we were aggressive in doing it, and the board was very good about that. So we will be doing that. Next meeting, you'll learn about an electronic town hall that will be available going forward, where the work will be available to the public, and they'll be able to comment, and it will be available to you to comment as well. So we'll teach you about that next time, so you'll know about that. It won't be a surprise to you. Ensuring progress. So this didn't just depend on financial resources, but institutional creativity. And I want to mention, I'd like to encourage you, while finances are important, to sort of decide where you want to go and what you want to do before you really get into finances, because once you get into finances, it's hard to ever get at what else to do. So we can't avoid those, but I think that's probably towards the end of the process when you know what's most important. So finally, the basic schedule, and we won't go into this. This can change a little bit, but we know we need a new plan by July 2015. We plan on having monthly meetings. You're going to be essentially overwhelmed with a lot of information initially. It's going to be hard to keep up if you don't meet that regularly. We will have meetings for you to keep up if you can't meet meetings, and you will be able to call in if for some reason you're out of state and participate in that fashion if necessary. If you finish sooner, that's fine, but it's more important to develop a good plan, that you develop one that you agree with. Someone noted that we have 20 members of the committee, and didn't we need an odd number in case there were split votes? And my response, at least, was if we need that, we don't have a plan. You really need to be able to agree on this plan. It's also important to mention, some of you have heard about House Bill 2036, so there will be a 2036 commission that will be starting at some point. A couple of members have already been developed. The commissioner and our chair will be a part of that committee. You may not remember that when we developed Closing the Gaps, the Lieutenant Governor had the 21st Century Commission that started about a month after we did. And we know how to work with other groups, and we know that there will be representatives on that if there's any need, it will share. There will be a sharing of information. In fact, with that last 21st Century Commission actually recommended that Closing the Gaps on its very first page be followed, so we hope to have the same type of situation. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, we do need to have a performance system. We need to be able to keep up with our success. We need to be able to provide feedback to the schools and be in a position to discuss whether we're making progress with the schools. And as in the case with our population, our participation, that if we need to change things, depending on whatever goals you come up with, they're yours. Now, later on, as Mr. Hunt mentioned, you'll hear about the work of the council, and they've created a first pass at some things that they believe are important. But we're assuming you guys can go in whatever direction you think is most important. I think it's critical for you to know that now. I think some important work was done by that group, particularly in terms of the workforce that you'll want to attend to. But unless you have any questions, I think we can turn to Steve now.
David, let me just ask you one. The 2036 Commission, what is their deadline as far as turning in their report? Is it before the legislative session?
I don't think it has one.
It doesn't have a deadline.
It does not. Okay. So I mean, the July 2015, as opposed to say January, does put us past the legislative session. Correct. As opposed to before it. And I just wanted, if everybody feels comfortable, particularly at the coordinating board, that there won't be pressure to deliver.
Well, we have at least one board member that would like for us to have something prior to that.
Coordinating board
member.
Right.
We'll have to see how that plays out. But ultimately, we know that we need to have a plan before ready to go when Closing the Gaps completes its lifetime in 2015. So from our standpoint, we at least have to have it ready to go by July 2015. We also think we need to have enough time to vet it beyond this committee. And I think it would be it's going to be challenging just to develop a plan, period, before the legislative session, but to do it with adequate vetting, I think will be challenging. But, our board will have to weigh in on that. But the most important thing is to have a plan that's meaningful, that you have not spent your time here to produce something that's shelved. I think you all know that the last plan was not. Some aspects of it had more influence than others, but we hope to use your time wisely, and that you can really influence the future of higher education, and that it's a high-quality higher education for all the people of Texas. That's the main thing.
We'll plan on July 2015. If there's any possibility of that changing to an earlier date, obviously, if we don't know that early, it's not going to be a successful rush to the finish, I think. So
I assure you that you and Dr. Faulkner will get calls right away, and then everyone can confer, and we'll let you know, because we're all in a similar position. And
I have just been informed that the 2036 requires annual reports January 1st of every odd year. So they will have multiple reports. They don't have a deadline and then the commission goes away. It will be annual reports.
Thank you, Susan. Okay, with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Murdoch, who I'm sure everybody here knows, who is state demographer, U.S. demographer for the United States, and is now at Rice University. Steve?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Is it on now? Yeah, okay. Well, I want to talk to you today about the state's demographics, of course, and what's going on in terms of those. And it's based on some work that we've just finished in a book called Changing Texas. It really is the third in a series of books that we started in the 90s, looking at a set that we call the Texas Challenge series. But it looks at where we've come from, how far we've gone, and where we probably need to go if we look to the future. Well, this is a chart I like to say that shows that in every period of time since Texas first allowed the U.S. to join it, we have grown more rapidly than the country as a whole. And that continues to be the case, although we've had, as the country has, periods of slower growth in 2000, 2010 than we did from 1990 to 2000. When you look at our growth, we continue to be one of the leaders, however, in the last full decade before the last census. You see we were the fastest growing in numerical terms, grew by 4.3 million, even greater than California in numerical terms, which is a state that's 12 million larger than we are. So we had very, very rapid growth. And if you look at the most recent data we have, which shows growth through the period from the last census, which is always April 1st to July 31st of the year for an estimate in 2012, we continue to lead the country in terms of overall population growth. Now, growth is not everywhere in Texas, despite the fact that we have lots of growth. If you take those first 6 areas, they get about 90% of all the growth in Texas. And the other metropolitan areas and rural areas make up the rest. So our growth is really quite concentrated demographically. This is a chart that shows, for example, those red counties are the counties in Texas that have population decline. And some people say, what you do is you take I-35, you look to the west of that, that's where there's lots of counties that are struggling, and to the east of that you see counties that are growing quite rapidly. But notice that the growth, if you take the blue counties up there, is very much concentrated in our 3 large metropolitan areas, 4 metropolitan areas, the Dallas-Fort Worth area, this Houston area, and really this is a combination of Austin and San Antonio, 2 MSAs, and then you find down in the McAllen area some very substantial growth as well. We had 79 counties in the last decade that were declining, and although we've got phenomenal growth right now in our state from 2000 to 2013, which we'll look at in a minute, you see that if you take the last period of time for which we have county data, the number of counties declining is not 79 anymore, it's 96 counties that have had population decline in the most recent period of time. And we're seeing some decline in parts of East Texas that we didn't see decline before. Let's talk just a little bit about the regionality for a minute. And this is the 4 regions of the United States. And growth in the South and West has led everybody. If you look at this, for example, which is the change from 2010 census date April 1st to July 1st of 2013, you can see the growth has been 3 to 4 times as much in the South and West, and we're part of the South, as it has been in the Northeast and the Midwest. Texas growth in this 2010 to 13 has been 1.3 million, greater even than California. Florida had about 750,000. The interesting thing about Florida is Florida sometime this year will surpass New York to become the 3rd largest state in the country, and with New York becoming number 4. Probably the most important thing, I argue, for Texas, however, is not simply the growth in numbers, but change in the racial and ethnic composition of our state. And I'm going to show you a lot of different charts here, but I really want you to concentrate on just a few things. This is the numerical increase during the last decade. This is the percent growth for each group. So, for example, for the non-Hispanic white population in the state of Texas, it was 4.2%. For the Hispanic population, it was 41.8%. But then over here is a percent of all change that was attributable to each group. So, for example, from 2000 to 2010, about 11% of our growth was due to non-Hispanic whites, whereas 65% was due to Hispanics, about 12% to African Americans, and about 12% due to other racial and ethnic groups, Asian and other racial and ethnic groups. And this shows you the proportion. And as you see up here, the decade from 2000 to 2010 was the one in which we became a majority-minority state, joining 3 other states that fit that particular description. So 11% overall. And if you look at our population, one of the interesting things in Texas is kind of interesting little tidbit of fact, so to speak, is if you look at the population 18 and over, about half of that is non-Hispanic white, and about a third of it is Hispanic. That's the population 18 and over. If you look at the population under 18, you basically reverse those two. And that is under 18, about a third is non-Hispanic white, and about half is Hispanic, and the rest being African American, Asian, and other. Now, let's look a little bit at something here that kind of summarizes things. And I'm going to give you a set of maps, and I'll show these for the U.S. as well. And they got similar composition. That is, blue means growth, red means decline. We're going to look at each of the racial and ethnic groups, for example, in Texas, and look and see what the patterns were overall. This is non-Hispanic white population. We actually had 161 of our, and the ones that are pink, by the way, are counties where there's too little growth to really meaningfully designate the direction of growth. If you look up here, you see we had 161 counties declining in terms of non-Hispanic white population in Texas. We had 61 growing, and the 61 that were growing very much concentrated in those metropolitan areas. Now, this is the non-Hispanic white, or as Texans often say, Anglo population. This is the Hispanic population. Of our 254 counties, we had 22 that had declines in Hispanic populations. We had 228 that had increases in our Hispanic populations. If you take our African American population, we had about 100 here in pink. That was too small a number, less than 100 African Americans, in other words, in those counties. But when you look at the decline in growth, there were 102 declining and 83 increasing in terms of non-Hispanic, black, or African American populations. Notice, because we'll see this in a minute, that if you look across the old South part of Texas, some of the rural counties in the old southern part of that were part of the old South in a not only in a technical sense but in a real cultural and other sense, you'll see that there was some decline in those counties. This is the Asian population. Lots of counties, of course, that have too few to count, so to speak, too few Asians in order to be discussed. 150 of those counties. But of the rest, we had 97 increasing, we had 7 declining. Again, very much A lot of this concentration is in that triangle area. And frankly, when you go to many of the other areas, you find two characteristics seem to characterize growth areas. That is, there tends to either be a large university or a large medical center. And those tend to be, larger Asian populations in those particular counties. Well, that was Texas. Everybody knows Texas is diverse, right? I mean, after all, we've been diverse for long periods of time. Well, let's look at the U.S. Remember that only 11% of our growth in Texas was due to non-Hispanic whites. Only 11%. In the United States as a whole, it was 8%. 8% in the country as a whole. And you can see 55% was due to the Hispanic population, about 13% to the African American population, about 16% to the Asian population, and about 6% to all other population groups. We're still a country that's about 63 or 64%, if you will, non-Hispanic white, but you can see the direction of change. So let's take a minute here and look at a key population, that less than 18 population, the kids that are coming. I want you to notice, forget the percent change for a minute, because that is a function of this, and you notice that we had a net decline of 4.3 million non-Hispanic white children. They moved into other ages, they weren't replaced at the bottom lands because of birth rates and other factors. And on the other hand, we had an increase of 4.8 million Hispanic children. In fact, had it not been for the growth in the number of Hispanic children, we would have had one of the largest declines in the child population in U.S. history. Very different patterns for our two population groups. Well, let's talk about the U.S. Again, we're going to do the same thing. Blue is growth, red is decline. We have about 3,200 counties in the country. We have various things, but again, we'll look just at the blue and the red up here. We had about 1,500 that had growth in terms of non-Hispanic white populations. About 1,700 had decline. This is the non-Hispanic white population. This is the Hispanic population. So if you're one of those people that thinks Hispanic population growth is a Texas, California, Florida phenomena, you're wrong. It is increasingly a national phenomenon. So we had about 2,700 growing for 100 declining in terms of those counties that had significant enough numbers to count. This is the African American population, about 2-to-1 growth to decline. But if you look at some of these rural counties, again in the Old South, you see population declines there, like as was true in Texas as a whole. But about 2 growth to each one declining. So let's take a look for just a few minutes, and we'll do this very quickly, at those same factors, but we're going to look at them for our metropolitan areas, or some of our metropolitan areas anyway. You can see this is the Austin, Round Rock area, metropolitan area. 39% of the growth was due to non-Hispanic whites. And I've done something here too. I've changed the order. I've changed the order for non-Hispanic blacks and Hispanics. But about 45% of the growth here was in terms of Hispanic population. And the percent went down to about 54% as non-Hispanic white as of 2010 in the metropolitan area. Now this is the child population. Yes, in Austin, there's now less than 50% of the kids that are non-Hispanic white. In fact, the number of kids that are Hispanic exceeds the number of kids that are non-Hispanic white in Austin, as in other parts of the state. And you can see that of the total change, 65% of the growth, just as in the state, in this area, was due to Hispanic children. This is Dallas-Fort Worth. It is an area that by 2010, the entire MSA is about 50% non-Hispanic white, 50% minority. 52% of the growth was due to Hispanic population. This is the under 18 population. This now is at 39% of the total population is non-Hispanic white, 37% is Hispanic. This is the under 18 population. This is the El Paso MSA. Of course, very strong growth, but again, almost all of that, a lot of that growth coming as a result of increases in Hispanic populations, decline in non-Hispanic white population. This is the less than 18 decline, absolute decline number of non-Hispanic white children. And if we look at the Houston Woodlands area, what do we see? Well, we see About a 40% of the population now in that area is non-Hispanic white. Now, let me remind you, this is the MSA. This includes the suburbs. This includes Katy. This includes the Woodlands. So this isn't talking about the central cities, which I'll mention that in just a few minutes. And you see that about 61% of all the growth during that period came as a result from Hispanic population, about 18% from African American population. Under 18, substantial decline in the number of non-Hispanic white children, offset by growth in all other population groups, and about a 250,000 increase in the number of Hispanic children. This is San Antonio. San Antonio had substantial growth in the Hispanic population. It's only 36%. That's probably not a surprise to most people. But it had, again, a decline in the number of non-Hispanic white children. Now, having been through these MSAs, I have a question that you have to answer. It's one of those questions we have to answer before we can go on. And I know, now Mr. Hunt has no reason not to know this, because we talked about it the other day. And I think Mr. Margot was there too, right? Okay. There's this question. If you look at the cities, we have 3 of the 10 largest cities in the country. Number 4 is Houston, number 7 is San Antonio, and number 9 is Dallas. In which of those 3 cities, has the largest proportion of its children who are non-Hispanic white?
San Antonio.
San Antonio, 16.9%. That is because the city of Dallas has 14.5%. The city of Houston has 14.6% of all their children that are non-Hispanic white.
And you've dropped out the suburbs in this.
Yeah, that's just the cities. That's just the cities. You've seen this with the suburbs in there, okay? But the point of it is that usually people in the public, not the people as well informed as you are, will say, oh, it's got to be, Dallas or Houston. And they'll fight about that depending on where they're at. And then they'll be surprised that San Antonio is actually ahead in terms of overall proportions. Well, who cares about the numbers? Why does it matter how much population growth we have? Why does it matter what the racial and ethnic composition of our population is? Well, I argue that it matters because due to a variety of historical, discriminatory, and other factors, these demographic characteristics are tied to socioeconomic characteristics. They are tied to the resources that people have to buy goods and services in the private sector. They are tied to the resources that people have to pay taxes in the public sector. And if we don't change the socioeconomics that go with our demographics, as we change our population, we will change the very socioeconomic characteristics, the very economy, if you will, of Texas. Well, let's look at these characteristics for just a few minutes. And again, we're going to do lots of tables, but I only want you to look at a couple things. Overall, what we find, whether we look at the U.S. or Texas or others, is that poverty rates for African American and Hispanics are about 2 to 2.5 to 3 times as high as they are for non-Hispanic whites. Incomes vary from about 60 to about 75% of what they are. That is, for Hispanics and African Americans, they're about 60 to 75% of what the incomes are for non-Hispanic whites. This is the U.S. It's true for the U.S. When you look at it in terms of Texas, again, about 2 to 2.5 to 1. This is the Austin Round Rock area, about 2.5 to 1. You look for Dallas-Fort Worth, about 3 to 1 in this case. When you look at Houston, similar kind of pattern, about 3 to 1. And if you, let's go back one, and if you look at San Antonio, you'll see about 2 to 2.5 to 1. Although you may notice something a little different. Notice these absolute values. Let's go back. Now this is Houston, etc. Well, you'll see that San Antonio has just a little bit lower rates, if you will, in terms of poverty. We'll talk about that in a minute. We'll talk about why. This is El Paso. And you see again here very high rates of poverty for Hispanics relative to and African Americans compared to non-Hispanic whites. Well, let's talk about school for a minute. Let's talk about education, because those are also related to, unfortunately, to demographic differences. And I'm going to show you just this one chart to begin, and then we'll look at percentages. But just to kind of get a feel for this, let's just look at the percent of Hispanics with less than a high school degree. In the U.S., this is 38%. In Texas, this is 40%. That's the red bars up there. Now, if we just look here, this is the Austin Round Rock MSA, 35%. This is the city of Austin, 39%. This is Dallas-Fort Worth MSA, 46%. This is the city of Dallas, 56%. This is Houston MSA, 44%. This is the MSA, this is the city of Houston, 51%. And here's San Antonio, 28% in the MSA, 28%, about 29% in San Antonio. Now, why is it San Antonio looks somewhat better than Houston or Dallas? Why do you think that might be in terms of the poverty rates for Hispanics and educational levels for Hispanics? Somewhat, but what?
Smaller immigrant fraction.
Smaller immigrant fraction, or another way to say that Hispanics have been there a long period of time. What we know about immigrants, and it was true, when the dumb Irish, I say that as a Murdoch with a K, right, came, it takes some generations. And what you have in San Antonio is an old Hispanic city. I remember the first time I drove in San Antonio and I was driving down, and I saw this street. It said Fredericksburg. I said, well, they didn't tell me the right thing. I didn't realize this was a German city in San Antonio. And then I took the next one, okay, and it was De Zavala, right? Well, that city has been an old Hispanic city and an integrated group that have done better because they've been in there more generations, as immigrants tend to do. Okay, and here's El Paso. Again, higher, but not as high as you see, for example, in places like Dallas and Fort Worth. Okay, well, for example, in El Paso, we're looking at 32% here, for example, versus 56% in the city of Dallas. Well, where are we going? This is the U.S. numbers, and the U.S. is projected to grow about, this is in thousands, to grow to be about 420 million people by 2060. And if you look at these population groups, this is what's going to happen to non-Hispanic whites. This is what's going to happen to Hispanics, to African Americans, this is to Asians, this is to everyone else except Hispanics. Now, that means if you look at it in terms of a amount of growth, you can see that overall the country is going to grow by 111 million. 78 million of that is going to be Hispanic. And we're actually going to have about an 18 million decline, absolute decline. And this is a 60-year period for the census. They're a little more daring than we demographers at the state level are in terms of population change. Now, here's a chart that when the person brought this to me that had done it, I said, you can't. What are you doing? And she said, what do you mean? I'm doing what you asked me to do. And I said, but you got a 0 on a pie chart. Every pie chart has a proportion due to each racial and ethnic group. She said, well, what do you do with a group that's declining by 18 million? You can't give them part of the pie. They're no longer a part of the pie. That is, they're no longer part of the growth that is occurring in the population. And if you start looking at another particular thing that is important to know here, we all know about the aging of the population, but it shows up pretty quickly here. 13% in 2010, going to be about 22% of us in 2060. Well, I don't expect to be around in 2060. There may be, I'm trying to find somebody who might be young enough. Well, never mind. Here's a chart. I just want you to look at one thing. This is in 2010, the percent of the population of the United States by age group that is expected to be non-Hispanic white. And you see in every age group, 50% or more of the population is expected to be non-Hispanic, or was not non-Hispanic white in 2010. By 2060, there's only one age group in which 50% or more, and that is the population 65 years of age or older. Well, this is Texas. Our projection is done with the State Data Center. About 55 million people we think we'll have in Texas by 2050. If you look at the growth, you can see where the growth is going to be, about 600,000 for non-Hispanic whites, something like 2.4 million, 2.3 million for African Americans, about 21 million, 20 to 21 million for Hispanics, and you can see about 6 million for Asians and others. If you look at it in percentage terms, we expect the state was already, as we know, by 2010, a majority minority. 45% was non-Hispanic white. Even if there's no migration, only a third will be non-Hispanic white by 2050. And we expect it'll be more like about 22 to 24% will be non-Hispanic white by 2050. About 56% will be Hispanic, about 13% Asian, another about 10%, 9 to 10% will be African American. If you look at net growth, so that these add up to 100, if you look here, this is the amount of our growth from 2010 to 2050 that we expect to be due to non-Hispanic whites, 2.1%. This is the amount we expect to be due to Hispanics, 71%, Asians about 19, 20%, African Americans about 8%. This is the age distribution, and here I want to just show you two things. Let's just take this bottom line. This is the proportion of each population that will be 65 plus, here and here and here, etc., down the bottom. Notice that the group with the largest proportion in terms of their population being elderly will be non-Hispanic whites, followed by African Americans, followed by Asians and others, followed by Hispanics. And then we did this chart another way and said, okay, of all the people who will be 65 plus, what racial and ethnic groups will they be from? Well, the largest single group of elderly, because of the numerical change, will be actually elderly Hispanics, followed by elderly non-Hispanic whites, etc. Well, this is a chart that this group is probably somewhat too old for, because I usually show this to a bunch of college kids, and I try to tell them, I know we're getting this elderly population. Just all you have to do is look at me. And you want to know where are you going to be able to live that you don't have to live with the old people. Well, this is 2010, and blue counties are those counties that over 20% are 65 years of age or older. That's that 1 in 5 Americans that will be 65 years of age. And then we say it like that, like it's a plague. And I resent that now I'm in those ages. Anyway, but notice, I try to give them hope when they look at this. So this is 2010, and this is 2050. Blue again has the same meaning. Now you can live some places where you won't have to live with elderly folks as much. You can live in College Station. I'm guessing that Dr. Faulkner would love to live in College Station. He'd be extremely popular, I'm sure. I'm kidding. And you can see how few counties and how that there will be a lot of older people. Well, let's talk about education for a minute. This is a chart that simply shows what we all know is that education pays. This is a chart that looks at unemployment rates in 2011, in one of the worst periods we know in our recent economic history. But notice that this was the average unemployment rate, and if you had less than an associate degree, you had a greater chance or a higher rate of unemployment, and unemployment went down as you went up the scale. The other is weekly earnings. You can see the difference, for example, with less than a high school degree to a graduate or doctoral degree. So education literally pays. But this chart is one I want to spend just a couple minutes with because I think it's so important. This is Texas in 2010, and this is race by educational level by average household income. What I want you to note is it doesn't matter. You can even be a laborer, but having more education pays. Look at the difference here between someone with a graduate degree or someone with a bachelor's degree versus someone with less than a high school degree. And that's true for all racial and ethnic groups. Now, you're going to look at some of these and you're going to say, well, wait a minute now. It's not the same. If you look up there under manager and professional, it's $150,000. If you're non-Hispanic white, it's $99,000. If you're non-Hispanic black or African American, it's going to be 116%. If you're Hispanic, 131% if you're Asian and other. Well, lots of factors go into that income. And one of those is that if you're a first-generation person with a doctoral degree, you have the resources that you have from what you've made. On the other hand, if you're the fourth generation, mom and dad and maybe grandfather and grandmother passed some resources on to you. And there are other factors that play a role too that sociologists talk about more, but we don't have time for that today. This is where we did from 90 to 2000. And when you look at this college and higher, and you look from 90, for example, to 2010, you say, well, how well did we do? Well, we went up almost 9 percentage points in terms of percent with a college degree and higher for non-Hispanic whites. We went up about 8% in terms of growth in the percent of African Americans with college or higher. We went up about 4.3% for Hispanics. Now, did we make, and Asians up about 4.7%. Did we make progress in all groups? Yes. Was the progress the same in all groups? No. So we're making progress, but we're not closing the gaps entirely, at least in the last 20 years. Okay, let me go. We're moving right along here. This is one that some of you are very aware of, but this is expenditures in education for the last decade in the state. And this is per student. From 2000 to 2010, we increased it about 3% for elementary and secondary education per student. And if you take public colleges and universities, we actually had a per student decline of 28% in terms of expenditures, in terms of general revenue expenditures for our colleges and universities. Let's talk about projections for the future. This is projections, and this is total public education. This is elementary and secondary, 6 to 11 overall, about 5.6 million, about doubling, almost a doubling when it comes to elementary and secondary. And you can see percentages, and in all cases, of course, we already have a majority of our kids in elementary and secondary education that are Hispanic. This was in 2010. That happened about 2011 or 12. But you see that the dramatic change and the dramatic decline in the percent that are non-Hispanic white. This is colleges and universities. About doubling here, about 70-80% there. Almost a doubling overall in terms of total colleges and universities. And this is the proportions. And so we see some increases here. The one that I have some alarm about or some concern about is this one. That is, there's nothing in the demographics that wouldn't make this participation and this participation be almost the same. But they're not. There's a 10% difference in terms of the proportion of those students that are non-Hispanic white in public universities, less than in public community colleges. This is, again, education expenditures, public colleges and universities, etc. I'm going to leave a copy of this so you can spend more time if you really like numbers going over these. And this is unmet financial need. This is the one that is kind of startling, okay, because that doubles over the next 40 years. And when you look at it in terms of percentage increase during that period of time, look at the percentage increases over here. Why is this going down? The need going down is because the absolute numbers are declining of kids, okay? And these reflect growth in populations. This is a percentage. You got to watch it here because it's a smaller base, so any increase gives you a larger percentage increase than it does if you have a larger base. But in all cases, we're seeing the most growth among the most needy populations, which is, I guess, what you'd expect. This is in terms of the resources enrollment in terms of kids with unmet financial need. Again, and what then does all this mean? What does it mean socioeconomically? Now here's a chart. This blue line up here is household change, 127.6%. And if everything was going along as you would expect it to be in some kind of average way from racial and ethnic groups, what you'd have is that everything you would hope would be either at this level or above this level. If there weren't factors about the income and other socioeconomic resources of our population. So this is projected for 2000 to 2050. The only thing that we project that will exceed our household population growth is our growth in poverty. We're just taking the numbers, we're grinding them through, okay? We do pretty good on aggregate household income. We don't do very good on average household income. There's actually a net decline, net worth, consumer expenditures, etc. And so let's look at it this way. Because I didn't think, I'll spend a little more time than I did the other day. This is where we are now. And this is what happens if the demographic composition changes, but there is no change from 2010 levels by 2050 in constant dollars in terms of the incomes this is per capita. So we'd experience about a 3,000 decline in real per capita income. Now we did make some changes. We did do some things, and if you take the average rates of closure from 90 to 2010, we increased this about 10,000 over time. Now this has got, understand this has a couple of very good decades in it, and has one pretty lousy decade in it. So, whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But if we could close the gaps, we would double the per capita income in the state. I'll just concentrate on this. This is a 7,000 decline in average household income. We could double it almost if we could close the gaps. We have consumer expenditures would actually go down about 4,000. It could go up about 40,000. Our poverty rate would go up about 3% if we do nothing. In fact, even if we had average closures, we'd still have a higher poverty rate than we did in 2010. But we could drop it by, as you can see, about 6% from the 17 to about 11.9. This is aggregate consumer expenditures in billions. We could take that up over 4.5 times if we could close the gaps. And here is the difference that we would have for state tax revenues from 34 billion to about 148 billion. We could do quite a bit of different things in the state if we had 148 billion in annual revenues. Well, let me kind of summarize where we are, I think, in terms of demographics and socioeconomics. And first let me say that we in this country and in this state basically have two populations. One is an aging, literally off the end of the life chart, set of non-Hispanic whites. Our fertility rates have been below replacement now for about 25 years. The average non-Hispanic white woman in the United States is 41 to 42 years of age. So if we're going to have a lot more babies, we'd better get at it. And some of you, if in the Houston area, know a colleague of mine that does a lot of work with the city of Houston, a gentleman by the name of Kleinberg. And he said that I should make sure to tell all of you that regarding this problem, he is willing to help in any way that he can. Okay. So, how else could we grow? We non-Hispanic whites. We could grow through immigration. But Europe, where most of our forefathers came from, is the oldest, slowest growing major region of the world, and the only major region of the world that the United Nations projects to have fewer people in 2050 than it did in 2000. Well, what's the other populations that are out there? And I'll just take one. Now let me say African American populations have demographic characteristics now that are a lot more like non-Hispanic whites. Their birth rates are below replacement. There's a great potential for increases in immigration, but there's not any there yet to any great extent. There's some, but not enough to change the overall dynamics. But the group that stands out, of course, is Hispanics. The average Hispanic woman in the United States is 27 to 28 years of age. There's a lot of childbearing years between 27 and 28 and 41 to 42. Okay? Their fertility is still above replacement, although it has been declining. And although immigration has declined recently, they're growing also as a result of immigration. Well, when you look at these numbers, what do I surmise? It's simply this: that the reality of Texas is increasingly tied to its minority populations. And how well they do is how well Texas will do. But you know, since I started doing this a few years ago, I don't want to talk about how long ago it was, we've got a lot of people that have joined us. One of them is this little country we're part of. The United States of America is changing somewhat more slowly, but in exactly the same directions. We have in every part of the country now, among non-Hispanic whites, there are more deaths than births. South, the West, East, Northeast, Midwest, same kind of patterns and same kind of migration factors. Well, a lot longer ago than I like to think about it now, when I first got involved in this demographic game, I had a fellow graduate student come up to me rather, and say, you know, I don't know why you do this. You know, it's so dull, nobody cares. Well, I don't believe that's true. I believe we do care. And I believe that the reality is that unless we change these things, we're looking for a very different Texas and a very different America. And I believe, because the single best predictor in all the statistical analysis that have been done of socioeconomic achievement is education. So our future is not only tied to how well minority populations do in an economic sense, but more important to us, it is tied to how well they do in an education sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. David, could you comment on Steve's relationship ongoing with this committee?
Thank you. I was hoping to have that opportunity. Steve is a special advisor to the committee, and from our standpoint, we consider him part of the committee, though a non-voting member, as he's currently employed by Rice. But we hope that he'll participate in the conversations in the same way you will, and hopefully he will be able to help us clarify some of these questions as we go forward. So unless something changes, he'll be with us every meeting. So he's an important resource. And I could say I've probably heard him 45, 50 times. And I learned something every time. And it's the message I heard today was, wow, it's really critical that we've done what we've been doing for the last 10 years, but we're not even close to being where we should be. And there's a lot of work to be done. I think all of you can make a big help in moving us in that direction, and with Steve's help.
Right, and David or Susan, if you could make sure that all of the committee gets all of the PowerPoints today that have been presented.
We are setting up a place on our website. We'll be putting everything that comes to you on the website, all the presentations, everything, so that you can download it at any time.
Does the committee feel comfortable with that, or would you'd rather have an email that's forwarded to you with all the data?
If anyone wants paper copies, just let us know and we'll do that.
Yeah.
And I can say that there's usually a little gap between having presentations online, but when we do, you'll have an opportunity to listen to Steve's presentation more slowly with paper in front of you, because there's a lot of information there, and I know I'm going to have to go back and review it a few times because there's a lot embedded there. So,
but Mr. Chairman, can I?
Yes.
Could we have them sent to us by email with
Certainly.
a link? Just a link?
Sure.
That makes it easier.
That's not a problem at all.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a quick question of Dr. Murdoch. As the population shifts and as what we used to know as minority becoming the majority and already is the majority. I've seen data recently where the disaggregated number of an other is not just other as we all used to know it, but actually a mixed race, mixed ethnicity. Do you predict, especially in your data showing school children, preschool moving up, do you predict a time in the near future where there might be a piece of that pie that is made up of an other of a mixed race ethnicity?
Well, you actually have those data if you look at the full census. And there's 126 categories if you're something like that, if you take all the combinations and permutations. I think the thing that, and remember the census doesn't decide what your racial and ethnic composition is, you do. And it takes exactly what you say on the form. And there was a good deal of controversy for the last census. I was there at the last census, and we had a director who said, we had about 6% that said they were two or more races, and I'll bet we're going to have 15% this census. We had about 6%. Now, that doesn't mean that's necessarily reality, meaning it is what you say you are. But we don't have any indication, on the other hand, that people are lying about their racial and ethnic composition. We have a few people that say, well, I've been in the United States for so long, I'm part of every group. Okay, so you have a very small number. But the proportion of, I think, to answer your question more directly, I think that those numbers will go up. But what's really important here is you're not going to change the socioeconomics necessarily because you changed the combinations. It lies in other factors that are there that have gone along with the socioeconomics. I remember one time I had a gentleman who was convinced that we didn't have to worry about any of these factors because intermarriage would take care of it all. And the idea was that I said, well, you must be suggesting then that richer non-Hispanic whites are going to marry poorer minorities and that'll take care of it. And no, that's not exactly what he meant, he said. We looked at that, did an analysis, and what we found out is that if you took all the cases, in 3 of every 4 cases, it was the minority with the college education that was marrying the non-Hispanic white with a high school education. And from a sociological standpoint, that makes sense, power trade-off, et cetera, et cetera. We don't need to get into all of that. But yeah, that'll change the percentages. I think it'll change it over time. I think 100 years from now, I would hope at least that it would be, for many of our population, just like me. I'm Irish, right? Well, my name is Irish. That's about all that's Irish in me, in terms of I'm as much English and German and et cetera as I am Irish. But that isn't happening as fast as we thought it was going to happen, and it will happen faster. We do know it'll happen faster if the socioeconomics and educational differences disappear, because we know that the rates of intermarriage are higher for college graduates than they are for people who have less than a high school degree. And if you think about that a little bit, and I think use some of your own experience as you think back to your own communities, you'll see why that is the case. Part of how you interact with others is based on being in educational settings where there's a variety of people.
Right. Dr. Faulkner?
Yeah, I'd like to make one point on some of the data Steve showed. He goes pretty fast. So let me ask you all to look at this when you go back through it. But Steve showed a chart of earning power, essentially, for various educational levels. And one thing I'd like to draw your attention to is some college, no degree. There's a line in there for some college, no degree. And the important thing I'd like for you to realize is that the earning power is just a little above high school diploma, lower than associate's degree. The point that I really want to make is that he's put a lot of emphasis on the fact that we have to improve educational attainment especially among our minority populations in Texas. But we need to take that attainment to the point of a credential. You know, if kids get through school with, well, they don't get through school with no credential. If their experience is to terminate without a credential, it hardly affects their earning power relative to high school diploma. That's a really important point. So getting to the end, very important.
Yeah, and let me just say that the data also show that there can be a lot of college credits.
That's right.
But if you don't get that attainment, it means almost nothing.
Right.
At the risk of
question as well.
Yeah. At the risk of being reversed by our state demographer, national demographer, I'd like to make a few quick comments, and then we need to move on. If you look at Texas and you look at birth to 24, which is really the bulk of the people that are in school of some sort, 60% of that population is Hispanic and African American. Of all the 50 states, we have the highest concentration. If you look at our K through 12 system, 65% are Hispanic, 50% approximately, and 15% African American. So, that's the reality if you boil down Steve's numbers there of where we are today, and it's only accelerating over time. If you look at the pipeline of how are things changing, and the Houston Endowment, under Larry's leadership, gave some grants to do taking coordinating board data and taking 8th graders. The last study was 2001, time to graduate from high school, 6 years to get through some type of higher education attainment, and about 20% are actually obtaining something. About 28% Anglos, and minorities at about 11%. So it's about a 40% rate. In other words, the relationship between Hispanic and African American higher education attainment and Anglo attainment is about 40%. And when you look at Steve's numbers, there is no growth in the Anglo population except over 65 going forward. All of the growth is minority, and most of that is Hispanic. And so that's what I commented earlier, this tension that we have between a demographic change and an attainment, closing the gaps on attainment. And so far, we're losing that. We're losing that ground. And so that's translating into today. If you take the old guys in the workforce, in fact, I'm even past that age, but the 55 to 64-year group, and you looked at Texas and you treated us as a country, which sometimes we like to think of ourselves as, we're number 3 in the world. I mean, versus the U.S., we're below the U.S. and below Canada. If you look at the 25 to 34-year-olds, we're number 24 in the world. And so it's not only in an absolute sense that we have marginal decline, in other words, older being more educated than younger, which is the case. We've had an absolute decline in that decade of the younger decade of the workforce versus those 3 decades that came before. But more importantly to me is we've had a huge relative decline. In other words, our position that was number 3, and I mean highly competitive, is now 24, and it's not turning around. It really going straight down. And so that's our real challenge. The rest of the world, their decades, as you get younger, it looks like this. Each decade is getting more and more educated. I mean, Mexico, our neighbor to the south, our old guys are 3 times more educated than Mexico. We're only 10 points ahead when you get 32% to 22% when you look at the 25 to 34-year-olds. Canada's at 56% in that age. So when you look at the jobs, where are the jobs going to be that pay, that need capabilities that are reflected in higher education attainment? Where are those jobs going to be, and the compensation that goes with those? Who are we going to compete with? Is it going to be Mexico? Is it going to be Canada or New York that's at 54, 55%? So I see that gap between Texas at 32% and say New York at 54% in terms of higher education attainment of the workforce is income. I mean, that's income that goes into quality of life. It goes into more resources that can be spent for better education. So it's a positive cycle of competitiveness, and we are in a negative cycle of competitiveness. helped like some other places in the world because we have a lot of natural resources. But the question is how sustainable over time is that comparative advantage that we have that allows our income levels today to be at about 95% of the national average, where they should be at probably about 88% of the national average because of the high correlation, as Steve pointed out, between income and education levels, which is about 80%. So I'll finish with one, and the reason I'm here today and why I've been focused on this is I was a part of the 1950 census. I was one of those points in El Paso when our educational level was 20% higher than the state of Texas, and our income level was 14%. I was also part of the 2000 census when our income level, our educational level was 30% below the state of Texas, and our income level was also 30% below the Texas. So if it can happen in a city of 800,000, that same demographic change, and I won't disagree that the state of Texas has some resources that will help differentiate, but I would argue that the demographics are stronger over time, that our loss of human capital competitiveness is the ultimate driver of our ability to maintain our economic well-being, and we're losing that race. So that's why I'm here today. That's why I'm willing to put my time in, because I think this is the central question that the state has to face, and that we have, notwithstanding closing the gaps, and we'll get into details from that, we're losing the race. And part of our argument or our discussion, I think, that means that we need to be much more transparent and willing, which politically is difficult for political leaders to do, to admit that we've got a deficiency. I mean, this is our Achilles heel, and we need to essentially be transparent in having a discussion about what we're going to do to solve this problem.
But aren't you also, I guess, I want to make sure I understand, but I think also if we close those gaps between the racial and ethnic groups, we wouldn't have the degree of the problem that you think we have right now, or that you have.
Well, if you look at, as you know, I mean, in the Anglo population in the state of Texas is, in terms of higher education attainment, if you looked at 25 to 65-year-old group, is slightly better educated than the Anglo population in the United States, about 44.5% versus a little over 43%. If you look at the minority population, we're 20% versus the country at a little less than 23%. So we've got a 24.5% gap between the education of our adult Anglo population in the workforce versus our adult minority population. And it's that gap that leads to the income gaps, that leads to the lack of resources for the children to be able to access the educational competitiveness that they need and which we need. And I mean, the political proposition to me at the bottom line is, and the numbers I think point all this out, is how do we convince an aging Anglo population, which possesses the majority of the financial resources of the state, to invest in a minority, largely Hispanic future? In other words, it's going to take good policy, and I would always recommend good policy before more resources, but it's going to take both if we want to close that gap faster than the demographic change. And so that's, to me, is kind of what we're all about here, is kind of presenting a plan or putting together a plan that over time can build the political support to bring about those changes. So we're at the 30,000-foot level. I think, as David said earlier, we're not really here to give a lot of specifics, but we're here to make at least I see, to make an argument of why this is our fundamental challenge, and it's a journey, and it's not going to be solved in any short time period. But if we don't address it, we will at some point be at a point where we will not have the resources to be able to address it.
Mr. Hunt, may I ask one question, please? Do you have any data about what percent of the Hispanic population now and on up through 2050 is not fluent in English?
There's some. Well, we didn't project that. We do have data that shows what it is historically, and we're seeing. I mean, the last data I've seen from public schools is that, it goes along with time and country. And the longer the people have been in the country, the more fluent they are in English. And that was true for every generation that came as primarily immigrants. And, if you go and look at our older cities in the Northeast, you often had a generation lag in that. One of my, anecdotes are always always dangerous. But the city of the major cities that I travel in most, which are, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, and Austin, and El Paso, but because of distance, I don't think it there as often. The city that I find more Hispanics that do not speak Spanish than any other city I work in, San Antonio, Texas. And why is that? It makes sense because here's the thing that has worked for generations. First generation comes, knows primarily the language of the country from which they came. The second generation knows both because they've got to both communicate with their parents and they've got to live in a new world with a new language. The third generation knows primarily the language of the country in which they now live. And in fact, just anecdotal things are always dangerous, but I remember a couple of years ago, I was speaking at the Hispanic Chamber in San Antonio, Texas. And when you're a speaker, they kind of put you at a table and say, stay there and don't get lost, right? And I looked around, and here I was with about 10, and they were all under 35 Hispanic, because it was the Hispanic Chamber that I was speaking to. And I heard this young lady say, my grandmother jabbers at me, and I can't understand a word she says. And her friend right next to her said, I know what you mean, I got the same problem. And so at the end of it, I said, excuse the demographer's question, but how many of you here do not speak Spanish? Now, this is the Hispanic Chamber. At least by appearance, everyone at that table was Hispanic. 5 of the 10 did not speak Spanish. So, that would have been what the Irish did, that would have been what the Germans did, that would have been what each and every population is. It's a cycle. And so what happens if you get a lot of new immigrants, and we've slowed down some on that, but as you get new immigrants, they come in primarily with the language in which they came.
Shall we, the group that we're trying to give a chance to go to college and get degrees, can we assume that they are fluent in English?
They won't be able to, in most cases, they won't be able to complete college in the United States, any place, if they don't have command of English. There's a few exceptions, but English language proficiency is one of the factors related to success for Hispanics not only in Texas but other countries.
But we don't have any data about what percent are fluent in English. Is that right?
We have language spoken at home, and I'm not what the school systems have, but we have language spoken at home from the census, and that data we could provide.
Steve, will what I call the San Antonio effect, or the tremendous in-migration from other states to Texas, will those two things mitigate the consequences of in the out years of your
Well, let me say something
presentation
about the latter, because I get lots of newspaper headlines that say, "Oh, massive movement of people from other states to Texas." And I looked at that data the other day because I wanted to make sure before I spoke at a group in El Paso. And historically, here's what we've had. 50% of our growth has been natural increase, the excess of births over deaths. And that has been increasing. In fact, it's now all minority growth, population groups. And the other half was, if you took the other half, about 25% of the total, in other words, half the half, was migration from other states, and half of that, another 25%, was migration from other countries. As of the most recent data, still half natural increase. The proportion that used to be 25 and 25 is now 30% from other states and 20% from other countries. But keep in mind what that means then is the net gain, 50 plus 20 is 70, has been 5%. So I don't yet see how, the growth is so, the trouble of it is, of course, as much as that, it gets to be anecdotal. If I met 3 people from California, everybody that's coming to Texas is from California. That does not mean we're not having that migration, but it is not nearly the size of factors that you'd think by reading popular press. Yes, sir.
Dr. Murdoch, I grew up in Laredo, And I'm like 14th generation American. We've been there since 1755 on my dad's side. But my mother was an immigrant. And I could always tell the difference between my uncles and aunts on my mother's side and my uncles and aunts on my dad's side. They were totally different. In one side, they spoke both English and Spanish. On the other side, it was almost all Spanish. But yet the next generation spoke both, and almost every cousin that I've got educated. And I think you alluded to San Antonio being, in that way, being an older city. And I've seen some studies too. I think Pew Institute has done some where second and third generation Hispanics do as well in college as non-Hispanic whites. But for the new immigrant, if you separated out the problems of an Hispanic population between first generation or new immigrants and second and third generations, I would imagine that the figures would be totally different. And so the question in my mind is, how do we address the problems that new immigrants have? And I'm talking about legal immigrants, although I guess you could group the other ones too. In reference to adult education, and English as a second language, and the GED program. In my experience, both here at Austin Community College and in Laredo, the funding has always been very limited. There have always been waiting lists for people that want to get educated. And if we're serious about inclusiveness for those new immigrants, we've got to get serious about their education and about English as a second language. I think there are more Hispanics that go through buying those programs like Inglés Sin Barreras, which are all in DVDs, I think, than going to class. And so what can we do insofar as the education of those new immigrants? And I think in most cases, I think in Texas, adult education is still within the Texas Education Agency rather than on the coordinating board side. Am I correct?
Now at TWC. It's got moved to the Workforce Commission.
I mean, of course, I'm not an educational expert in the same way that, for example, Shirley is. But I think there's no doubt what you're saying is correct. All the data do show that mastery of English, which comes along in most cases with generations, as you're saying in your case, in the country, is key to success in the American education system and, frankly, in the American economic system. And so mastery of the language that's dominant, whatever country you live in, is key to both educational success and economic success.
We got any more? Lionel, did you want something to say?
I just want to say that in my research in marketing to Latinos, which was my career for over 35 years, is that there is just this amazing desire to learn English as soon as possible. Immigrants know that they have to learn English if they're going to navigate this country. But I think, as Raymond was saying, the resources for them to learn it are not there. Where do I go? Where do I go to learn English? So they go to Inglés Sin Barreras, and they get these DVDs and so forth, and they try their very best, but it's expensive and difficult for them to do it. But the desire, the amazing desire to become part of the mainstream is there. The opportunity that we are able to, Henry Cisneros in San Antonio is just started a new center called the Cisneros Center for New Americans. And it is all of the things there. We've realized that throughout the country there is no real help for the folks to learn English, to learn the financial system, to learn the history, to learn the values of this country. But the desire is there, and that may be something that we may want to consider as we plan for the future.
Okay, we've gotten totally off schedule here, but I'm going to commit that we'll finish at 2 because I know people have time commitments. We might have to change the schedule a little bit. I'd like to go ahead David, have you do the update, and then we'll break for lunch, and then you and I can talk about how we might change the schedule.
Okay. Susan will do the update, and we actually built in some time at the end in that discussion. We have an hour discussion, so I think we can make up some ground at that point. So what you've done so far is good. We wanted you to talk, so
right.
That's a positive.
We're doing that.
Susan and I had talked. If you want, you could go on and take your break for lunch, and Susan could do this over lunch, if you'd like.
Good.
The food is
it's been a long time sitting here, so let's go ahead and break, and we'll reconvene. Let's try to be back in within 10 minutes.
What?
Do what you want.
Yeah. Just on the plans from the other day.
Yeah.
But the agency, when I was a superintendent.
I'm going to start out by reminding you about the goals of Closing the Gaps. We had 4 goals. They were very broad. We had participation, success, excellence in research. As David mentioned earlier, we actually had our participation goal realigned in 2005 after we got some updated projections. So you can see the slope of the line change upward. We looked at Steve's projections and said, oh, this number is really not going to get us where we want to be. So we changed it. The board changed it. We are actually, as you can tell, for this last time, we have a slight decline in enrollment. We have flattened off in other periods, but this was the first time of a decline. However, I will say we do not yet have in there the latest information from the career colleges. We're just getting that in. And we just now have the flex entry students. Those are students who don't get reported to the coordinating board to the spring, but they are actually on campus in the fall. So we won't have that information for another month. We'll give you updates, but we have flattened off. Part of that is, okay, here's the good news. Part of that is the economy is growing again, and so people are able to get jobs. The bad news is we still want them to be in school. We want them to continue in school. This is what it looks like on percentage, and we have 46.9, public 2-year and fall 12 is the red, and blue is fall 13. You'll notice that most of this drop was in the community colleges. Everybody else was going up, continued to increase. The community colleges had a slight decrease in their enrollment. It was and that actually ties very well with the economy. A lot of the community colleges, they're workforce-related jobs, that sort of thing. So that's probably why that is going on. Okay, guys, I hate to say this. Once again, I've said it before, I will say it again. Women are going, and not only going, but completing at higher rates than men. It's happening. It's happening in every racial, ethnic group. African American females are actually have the highest participation rate in the state. They're at 8.9%. White females are at 6%. Hispanic females at 5.9%. Y'all are holding us back. I don't know what to say. We're going to make y'all just keep going. I have 2 boys, and that just kind of scares me. So African American enrollment has grown well above our targets, looking at the population projections. As you can see, again, the African American enrollment taking a slight dip in 2013 for 2013. So that is a problem. That's something that we're going to have to talk about, look at closer, see what we can do to maybe get that to turn around. And this is very slow. Hispanic growth. We have focused on Hispanics. We have focused on Hispanics. The good news is, even in their preliminary, there is an increase. The bad news is they are not up to the line that we need them to be at. And as you can tell, we shifted our targets a little bit in 2005 to 2010, and then they shifted again because we are continuing to see that huge growth. We try to keep up. The targets for Closing the Gaps were set at 5.7% of the population in total and for each racial and ethnic group. So that was the way to get it consistent for all the groups. So as the 5.7%, as we get new population projections, we would adjust, and the board would vote to adjust or not adjust. And so that's where we're getting these actual numbers. Yes? We can break it out male and female. There is a huge difference. And if you, in the prior slide, the Hispanic female is actually at the 5.9. So on the left axis, you'll see the number going on. So even though the Hispanic female stayed at 5.9% of the population enrolled, the number went up. So their percentage stayed the same because we looked at that as a percentage of the population. I'll move on. We're going to switch over to success. It's another one of our measures. We are well above the 2010 or 2015 target of 210,000 additional students. We still need to get more out based on different racial and ethnic groups, but we're increased. This includes public, independent, and career colleges. And we look at undergraduate awards because so many of our community colleges award a lot of certificates, workforce certificates, and those are included in this. So this is not associates and above, which is what the census collects, is associates and above. Mm-hmm.
What you're calling it a award?
Right.
You mean a degree?
Degree or certificate. Mm-hmm.
What is a career?
A career school, those are the for-profits. University of Phoenix, DeVry, ITT, Virginia College. They're recognized. They offer certificate in associate, mostly bachelor's, and there's a few doctoral degrees awarded, but very minor, mostly from University of Phoenix and DeVry. And they report their information to us.
So that's an important difference in Texas and many other states is we not only have the public individual student records, we have them for the private universities, the SMUs, the Rices, Texas Lutheran, and also those students from Phoenix, DeVry, ITT, Western Governors. So we're actually able to look at that, and we can track graduation between those institutions as well.
Doctoral degrees were another one of our was another target, and we are well above that. This one actually, because we just started getting some of the career colleges reporting their doctoral degrees. This is actually for public and independents. We are well above our target there. This is African American. This was kind of interesting. So, in the prior slide, I showed that African American participation rate was well above where our target had been. Overall, if we split it out, they're not as much for the African American males. But for this one, they're above target on their awards, but they're not as above target. So they do not graduate at the same rate, and that's something that we need to look at because we're not getting the same graduation numbers as we are increases in their participation. In Hispanic, we have actually they're above their target for their success, even though they are not for their enrollments. And part of that has to do, the enrollments is tied so closely to the population projections, and they're growing so quickly. And so, truthfully, this would be a place, if we had more than a year and a half or so, that we would probably go back to our board and say, you know, we need to set stronger targets. With 2 years left, you kind of go, let's go on. Let's focus on the next one.
Now, you said you had adjusted the enrollment targets as the population has grown.
Yes.
Have you adjusted these credential targets?
We did in 2005. We did not go back and readjust in 2010. But we did in 2005 for this one.
And Susan, remember the actual number? It was increased by a very large amount, the number of awards that were required. Do you recall? It seems like it was almost at least 70,000.
We went from 106,000 to 210,000. It was a large, I think it was about 50,000 increase in awards that we wanted.
What I'd like to point out is closing the gaps. And as I said earlier, they were spot on and they were very early in identifying what needed to be done. But I guess as a critique is It's not connected to the workforce. It's not connected to any kind of national or international benchmarks. Essentially, we're setting, here's our target, and then how are we doing against our target? We did set some population goals, as I remember, against our top 10 competitor states. But for example, a percentage for a Hispanic population that, as Dr. Murdoch pointed out, is significantly younger than the Anglo population and who is significantly undereducated, to me is not particularly meaningful. In other words, that percentage probably needs to be much higher than the Anglo population if we're truly going to close the gap. So I guess my point is we need to think about, for the committee to begin to think about, as we move to replace closing the gaps, do we need to move where somebody else is controlling the standard that we're trying to meet? We're not setting our own standards, and if we're doing it very transparently, and then we're asking ourselves that we want to try to meet that benchmark, which is really going to reflect, at least in my opinion, should reflect the workforce, because that once again is what creates the resources for our quality of life and for our institutions, et cetera. So if the workforce is the right benchmark and that's being externally set, then the question is it against other states, is it against other countries, or is it some set of both that we identify who our international competitors are, whether they be a state or a country? Do we set those, and then we begin to look at very specifically what do we need to do to get to those numbers? So.
Let me clarify whether there was attention to the workforce, and there wasn't in the way I think you think it should be. But I do want to point out that there was a study by RAND which looked specifically at the workforce and worked with TWC, and essentially that study said we need more of everything except hairdressers. And so the group took on the idea that they established a task force on the technology workforce. So there was a very directed aspect. And if you look in Closing the Gaps, and you'll hear a little bit about this, but it's not nearly as broad as what you're talking about, there were critical fields were identified: engineering, math, the sciences, not biological sciences, because we were doing very well in terms of producing graduates there, teachers, and nurses. And at that point, we were hoping just to keep from having a decrease in nurses, because we had a decline. We've actually done better on that. So it was done in one aspect, but not in the more complete aspect I think you're asking. So I just want you done it. And you could appoint a similar task force if you chose to.
In addition, I would imagine that then, in 2000 versus now, the attention to dual credit and early college programs was not there. It was just starting to take hold and was somewhat questionable, like as to the success. And I think it would be interesting to look at what dual credit has done and how we've really gone down into the high schools and how that has impacted not only college participation but also success.
We have some of that data, and we will be glad to bring that next time.
Good observation.
This slide actually talks about what David mentioned was these the technical fields. On the prior slide, you saw that we weren't close to what the actual target had been. We had some declining years after 2000. We had some, especially in computer science, some years where it went down. We're starting to see that rebound in the engineering. Engineering technology is really starting to come up quite a bit in the last few years. It was pretty flat for about 8 or 9 years there. So this is the nursing and allied health. As David said, originally in 2000, we wanted to stop the decline. We had actually had 7 straight years of decline in nursing and allied health graduates. So our first target was just stop the decline, and that's when we then reset it. This actually has a lot to do. We had some very targeted legislative action that came into play. They started some nursing loan repayment programs. They started the Nursing Shortage Reduction Act. So there have been a lot of legislative strategies and efforts that have helped with the nursing and the allied health. So that may be a lesson learned, some of the things that we could look at for some of the other areas. Because it has made a difference. Oops. Unfortunately, teachers are not going quite the same direction. And as we all know, if you don't have the properly educated teachers, trained teachers to work with the students, you're not going to get them prepared out of high school and into college. So this is a huge issue. These were our targets for the math and science certifications, and that is really bad. You know, you get people that get a math and science degree, and then they get out of school, they start teaching, and Dr. Richardson is like, oh my gosh. So, I mean, this is a big issue. We want to get those trained teachers into the classroom.
And it's not unique to Texas, but last I looked, we had about 800 math graduates in Texas total, and we needed more math teachers, new math teachers, than we had graduates who, many of whom were not going into education. So that, I mean, that's, in terms of a lot of the competitiveness you're talking about, Mr. Hunt, I mean, part of it is, you know, getting more people prepared both to teach and also go into industry with at least an applied math background.
Do we have special scholarship programs for students majoring in math, science, or engineering?
There are a few, I don't know that there's scholarships, there's a few programs where they do have, I think it's maybe a loan repayment program, I can't remember, where they're working with they're working with the math science academies to get better prepared students into math and science in higher ed. So there are some of those. I don't know that they have any specific programs that are targeted with, not large programs.
There's the TG provided $25 million for a scholarship program for STEM fields to students who go to community colleges. So I think this is the second year of that program. So that's a very targeted program, and we have some promise in that, but we still have, you know, a lot to do. And frankly, just anecdotally talking to a lot of students, I've met students who are very good in the math and sciences or are not going into those fields. We also lose a large number of students that go into engineering initially who end up going to another field. And one of the analyses I saw actually suggested that some of the better prepared students were leaving engineering and going into other fields, so there might still be a science.
Is there any data suggesting that math and science majors would teach if the salaries were competitive with private sector?
I haven't seen any studies on that. I would assume that you would get at least more of them to teach if the salaries were more competitive, but I haven't seen any direct studies on that.
We've had some experience with that in the healthcare field, of course. You know, when you have that's really what would to me would threaten the success that we've had is that obviously you have to have nurses teach nurses, and they can make a whole lot more money, you know, if they work for a hospital. But there have been some hospital systems that have helped in an industry education type of alliance that have helped support the salaries of some of the nurse instructors, and that might be something to look at, you know, in specific areas, because it's important to the healthcare industry to have nurses, obviously.
We don't have a slide that indicates this, but one change over the last decade is, I think it still continues this year, and you might be aware of this, but that we have actually more teachers being certified through the alternative certification process than through our colleges of ed. And some of those will be individuals who've worked in industry. You know, I've actually known a few of those who have become math teachers military, but I also know those I know didn't last very long in teaching because it was harder than they thought it was going to be. And plus, they were taking salary cuts and needed to go back and would pick up. You know, they were taking $30,000 or $40,000 cuts to go into teaching.
But if I could comment for Bernie and tell you, Bernie, that we do, in those areas of critical shortages in the public schools, we do pay nice stipends in the areas of math, special ed, bilingual science, and, you know, 3, 5, $7,500. It's very attractive to go into that. Plus the STEM programs, the science, technology, engineering, and math. We start promoting those as early as elementary, and certainly when they start in middle school to do course selection, we're pushing students toward the STEM courses. So we're trying to fill the gap in that manner. But we do seek every source of employment. And you mentioned military. That's been one of our strongest sources for our special ed, math, and science teachers. It's been real interesting.
Wow. Is there charitable foundation interest in subsidizing STEM teachers' salaries?
Well, in our district, we were along the ship channel, so there was still a lot of manufacturing. There were a lot of folks very interested in that, and they're not that far from NASA. And we had great partnerships, and you just have to have the initiative to go out and find those scholarships. They're there. All your major universities will work with you, your engineering firms, just like Jerry said, they're there, and they usually come to you. And it's real interesting when you look at the breakdown of scholarships. You'll see, I remember specifically in Glenbard, for African American engineering students, for Hispanic engineering students, you'll see that over and over with partnerships through the school districts and large engineering, manufacturing, firms like that.
I think the point that's coming out of this is it's just not numbers. It's not a quantitative answer of trying to say this is how many completions that we need to be more competitive if we want to use workforce as our measurement. There's a qualitative. It doesn't end up solving our problem if all the degrees don't match the workforce. So essentially there's a demand side issue to evaluate along with the supply side, and what we need to do is be connecting those better together as we develop.
And as the committee goes forward, you might decide that you want to hear from someone, say from the Workforce Commission. I recently heard a presentation in which they were talking about skill sets, that whatever the degree is, that's the issue of the skill sets within the degree. And so you could have virtually any kind of degree and not have the skill sets necessary, at least for that immediate employment, or you could have degrees in a liberal arts area in which you thought you didn't have the skill sets, but in fact you did because the school worked to number one, let you know which skill sets you have, which not all students know, but number two, add some components to that. I understand that in the liberal arts school at UT Austin, to some extent, they've done some of that. I've heard secondhand. So, but as you move along, you may want to, if you'd be interested in that, I'm sure we could get them to come over and talk about some of their recent analysis of skills.
And for excellence, I wanted to point out that I hope everybody received this, and that talked about some of the successes that we've had in closing the gaps. Excellence has always been one of those things. It's very hard to measure and to put a number on excellence. Everybody's like, well, we have excellent programs. Measured by, that's one of those we know it when we see it type thing. So that's kind of where this document came from, is we know there's some good things that are going on, and so I'm not really going to talk a lot about that. We've had some improvement in the federal science and engineering, and this is another one where we actually changed the measure as we went into it. We had a dollar amount set for federal science and engineering obligations to the state. And then because the federal data, as you can see, the latest we have is 2009, because the federal data lags by so many years, by the time we got the 2000 data for the federal information, we had already surpassed our target for 2015. So we made some adjustments, and we actually set our new target to receive 6.5% of the federal obligations. So as you can see, we're at 5.6% in 2009. I don't really know where we're at in 2013. We're supposed to be getting the 2010 and 11 any day now. So even though the California dollars have gone up, their actual percentage of what the federal obligations are have gone down. And this is one where actually, Mr. Hunt, we actually do measure it as a percentage of how are we doing, how much of that federal money is the state getting.
An advantage of that is of course, the federal budget changes. So the dollar amount didn't really work as well as trying to get a larger share of that federal budget.
We also look at just federal research or R&D expenditures, because one of the things that we want to know is, because of the lag in the federal data, how are we doing right now? And this is the research, the amount of money that our colleges and universities are spending on research, and this is $3.8 billion right this year. You can see there was a little dip in 2012, and then it's kind of rebounded a little bit in 2013, and hopefully we'll continue moving forward.
And this isn't just federal dollars, it's federal, state, industry contracts. So it's much more inclusive in terms of research activity than just the federal dollars.
Are the federal dollars politicized?
Yes. They're very competitive federal dollars, of course, that are peer-reviewed and hard to attain. Then they're those that are essentially earmarked by state, and those are more political. But it's important to have a strong presence in the federal government for those say national labs. Before we started this process, and I'm not saying it happened because of this, but we didn't have a national lab in Texas. We do now, but you have places in other parts of the country that have been there for decades and continue to draw funds. And
California's outperformance is significantly affected by their historic relationship to national labs.
Well, the Johnson Space Center is essentially a national lab.
It is, and I was about to say, I'd forgotten that, and of course they're not faring as well right now either. But that's true. I should have said we didn't have one associated with an institution in Texas directly associated, though we do have the Texas Space Grant Consortium here, which involves multiple schools from UT to Rice to Houston to Tech.
A lot of that, probably most of the reason for the decline in 2012 was expiration of the stimulus, the special stimulus dollars.
Now we're going to talk a little bit about some national and international, looking at educational attainment and kind of how that might tie into some of the information. And as I've already warned Mr. Hunt, I stole one of his slides from an earlier meeting. This is nationally. Texas ranks 10th out of the 10 most populous states in the percent of our population with a associate degree or higher. So that's not a good sign. Here we have, this is the high school. This is just Texas compared to the U.S. So we have fewer high school graduates, fewer with some college, and some college in this instance actually includes certificate programs, because nationally they do not collect information on the certificate programs, and then associates and higher. This is one that you talked about earlier, and this is by age group. So if you look at the 25 to 34-year-olds in Texas, only 26.8% have an associate or higher, compared to the U.S. at 32%. And then if you look at the 45 to 65 age group, you've got 27% in Texas and 28%. So this nationally, even, it's gone up. So the younger population is actually more educated. More educated. In Texas, the younger population is actually less educated. So, as he mentioned earlier, this is not good. Okay, now I'm going to take some explaining. I would have used, and he didn't say it this time, Steve usually says in his presentations, as you can clearly see, in the upper right quadrant, you will look at, those are those that have attaining a high increasing advantage in their population. For example, Korea is the highest one up there, kind of up in the corner. Between their 24 to 35-year-olds and their 55 to 65-year-olds, there is a 50 percentage point difference in how educated with a college degree. So that's a huge difference. If you look at the U.S., we are barely over that 0% increase for that same age group. So even though we have roughly nationally 40% of our the population, 25 to 64, that has associate degree or higher, and right now Korea has roughly 40%. They are growing at such a rate that by the time their 25 to or 24 to 35-year-olds are up there, they are going to be far surpassing the U.S. in their educational attainment levels.
And to me, Susan, the story of Korea is if there's a will, you can actually accomplish it, because they went from a very undereducated, what is now an older population to a younger population that's at the top of the world. And you can argue associates versus bachelors and quality of degrees and all that, but still the relative rate of change in such a short period of time
Basically,
is really
this is
remarkable.
showing a 30-year time frame, and they changed 50 percentage points in that 30-year age group.
And maybe Steve could speak to this some, but one thing that we heard a lot about the changing, not only Texas, but U.S. demographics. But you don't see quite the same phenomenon in many of these other countries. They're much more homogeneous populations. And so, I wonder at times if it's a matter of us sort of recentering and catching up, whereas they've got a very different kind of population. Finland, which we've heard a lot about recently in terms of doing very well, they've actually begun to encounter problems as their population has recently changed. And so I think you have to be aware of these, but I don't know, do you have any?
Well,
you haven't seen this chart before, I don't think so.
The only thing I would say is one thing to understand is that best educated generation in the history of the United States. And we poured a lot of money into them in terms of getting them there. We had all kinds of NSF special programs that provided additional education in the sciences, et cetera. And they were a homogeneous population, pretty much, at that time. And so I don't think anyone, frankly, expects that we're going to reproduce the baby boomers in terms of relative level of education again in any time soon, because the population is so different. But I think that's you could have compared them to before and after, and you'd have been bemoaning the populations right after them, no matter what they'd been, because the baby boomers are just stand out in our thing, that 46 to 64 generation born in 1946, 1964. We've never had a generation like them. Brokaw, the Great Generation, et cetera, or the greatest generation was after World War II. But after that, we ended up with a generation that got lots of resources during a period in which, right after World War II, we were the only country still standing in a basic sense, and we poured a lot of money into a lot of things, including a lot of money into education, which hit those people born right after World War II all the way to 64. So the only thing I'm saying is that when you get a thing that compares that group, in age group, I think it's a pretty high standard. It's kind of like comparing, my football to one of the pros.
We certainly wouldn't do that.
You haven't seen me play football.
Well, but I think that what we need to understand is the differences, because these are certainly countries with whom we want to compete and be successful, and we can't think that we can sit and ignore that. And we have heard, say, with the council from Ames McGinnis from NCHEMS, who's done a lot of work with looking at some of this success overseas, and if the committee would like to hear him at some point, I'm sure we could at least get him here by Skype. I'm not sure what he's working on right now, but he has visited some of these countries and has paid some particular interest to that. So, But in some ways, it's on a large scale that the difference between what's happening in say Brownsville versus Houston versus Lubbock is that there are some of those differences in terms of local populations that you need to do some things a little differently. And we should at least know the differences and what to learn from and what the judgment of people in Texas wouldn't work here, but other things might be very successful.
Just a quick comment also. I think it's important to note that in the USA, we provide a free and appropriate public education for all children. That's not the case in many of these countries. They're sorted. Only certain children get into certain programs, and that's not the case in America. Our public schools are open to everyone who walks through the schoolhouse doors. How you ever disaggregate that, I don't know, but I think it's a very strong case, and it's not apples to apples, and I always get very defensive. It's not an excuse, but we're so often compared internationally, and I like a level playing field. We'll compete on any level playing field if the rules are the same. But you really have to look at the major difference in how public education, a free, appropriate public education is viewed here for any and all children, regardless of the language they speak, what their handicaps might be. We take them where they are and do the best we can. In so many of these countries, many of the children we educate would never be given a chance in it.
Yeah, Shirley, I don't disagree with that, I guess, but to me what the equalizer is if we measure the education levels of the workforce, because we have a lot of global firms today that make their investment decisions where in the world they're going to locate based on the educational qualifications of the workforce. So ultimately, what those numbers are, both quantitatively and qualitatively, will be the attractor of the jobs and will dictate the compensation for those jobs. So we get there in different ways. Germany, if you'll find them on one of the lists, is a surprising outlier when you look at the terms of their higher education attainment. But as Dr. Murdoch knows, they have a different. They start early. They dictate where you're going to go, and so the numbers don't look particularly good as far as workforce. But obviously, they have a very high performing economy. So we need to understand those nuances.
Could I? Yeah. Let me add something that to what David was just addressing. I think it is true that when you talk about the Koreans or the Finns or some other countries, Japan, you're talking about highly uniform societies with no ethnic diversity. But that's not true of Canada, and I'd urge that this committee keep Canada as a comparison point. The Canadians, if you look at the 25 to 34-year-olds, that's youth. The Canadians are doing twice as well as we are at producing a workforce that has a post-high school credential. Twice as well as we are. And we are not doing as well as we did in the generation before that. Almost, but we've essentially marked time relative to attainment versus the generation Steve talked about, the baby boom generation, versus we're in the 25 to 34-year-old age group. The Canadians are doing twice as well as that. In a diverse society, a society where there's a lot of rural locales that they have to try to reach with difficulty. I mean, they have many of the same problems we do. They're not as large a country, but they have many of the same problems educationally. And they're getting 56 or so % of their population with an associate's degree or higher.
I won't disagree with that, except one issue. There is diversity. But unlike ours, it's very much concentrated in just a couple of provinces. When you look in those provinces, they're not doing nearly as well as the Canadian overall statistics. And so where they have diversity, they have some of the same issues that we have. But because it's a much smaller proportion of the total pie, yes, they're populations that are quite uniform, and many things are doing very well. But if you go to certain provinces, you'll find ones that look like some U.S. states.
Are Canadian immigrants better educated?
Well, they're very selective in how
they're
they.
lots better educated.
Yeah.
In the 25 to 34-year-old age.
I mean, upon arrival, are they better educated?
What?
Upon arrival, the immigrants. Well, their immigrants are from different parts of the world, for one thing, and one of the things that, and I'm not trying to disagree with anybody here, but I think it's a good clarification to understand, is if you compare immigrants who've had to have enough resources to get a plane ticket or to do some kind of transport versus one that had to walk across the border, you're going to get a selected set of people. So, for example, one of our comparisons, and this is not at all to diminish the differences that we have, but we have some folks who come from areas that do very well, but they are not the same socioeconomic folks in terms of the families they came from and so forth. And in part because the people that would be equivalent to the person I talked about later aren't going to get here. You're not going to walk from China to the U.S. And so when people compare people who come to China to Hispanics, you're comparing apples and oranges. And if you have a society like in Canada, they have a very, very large proportion of their immigrants that are equivalent to our Asian immigrants, and they do very well, as do our Asian immigrants do very well. But it depends upon, how much selectivity you've already obtained, and to immigrate from China takes some resources. It just doesn't happen at the same level as it does with many people. And in a large country like this, where we have various sources of immigration, you're going to have a different set. And that's not to fault some of them. My best friend from high school would tell you the same thing. He lives in Canada his whole life. But when you look at Quebec, for example, doesn't have nearly the statistics that other parts. And that's a much more diverse area of Canada. So I'm not demeaning Canada. I'm not saying they don't do very well. I'm just saying that with diversity comes challenges, and particularly if that diversity is not as selective socioeconomically.
Right, and I don't disagree, Steve, but with the diversity, their composite average for the whole country is twice as good as what we're doing.
But their proportion of the diversity is much lower than our proportion of the diversity.
But the top of the world is twice as good as what we're doing.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing.
I mean, kind of following that, if you look at California, which is bigger than Canada in terms of population, it has an Hispanic and African American percentage in that birth to 24 that's only a little bit below Texas. I mean, we're pretty similar to California on Hispanic and African American as a percentage of the population. Where we're dissimilar is they have a much more significant Asian population, which way outperforms the Anglo population as well as every other population. So and California, but not by a lot, but by significant, outperforms Texas. So you can have diversity of populations, but then it begins what is the weighting. For example, if you take the state of Texas, I mean, we can outperform in every ethnic and racial group in terms of higher education attainment. In other words, we can be above the national average in performance in every one of those. But when you roll us together, we'll be below the national average because our demographics are overweighted in Hispanic and African American that have a lower performance level as far as higher education attainment. So that's kind of the reality of our particular mixture. Another mixture somewhere else could be different, weighted differently, and have different. So it gives it a different outcome.
But that's exactly what I'm saying. Is in both cases, I mean, California proves the point. Is that, as you said, their African American populations, their Hispanic populations do very little different than ours. But they have Asian populations that are more selective in terms of immigration. And the people who immigrate from Asia are going to have higher socioeconomic resources simply because you cannot be at the socioeconomic level that many of our Hispanic immigrants are and immigrate from 3,000 miles away. It doesn't work that way. So that part of that mix difference between, I fully agree, is the mix of that population. And part of why California looks different is that it's got a mix that is richer in the sense of people who are likely to have higher levels of education.
Yes, David.
I just would put on the table that this is something for you guys to think about. If you'd like for us to dedicate a meeting or to have a significant part of the April or May meeting to this topic, we would be glad to prepare that and get together some additional people to provide you some information. It seems like, at least for several of you, it's something you're very interested in, so that's up to you, Mr. Hunt.
Okay. Thank you. Do you all have any more to add on the closing of the gaps? Yeah. Okay. My only additional comment would be that there were four goals, as everyone might remember: participation, success, excellence, and research competitiveness. But there was no rank ordering on those four goals, as I remember. And at least I would argue that might have been beneficial, in that participation without a success, at least in my view, is underutilization of state resources. Success means is translated into a more competitive workforce and gives you more resources. And in the case of excellence and research competitiveness, which I'm very supportive of, I don't think they're sustainable in an economy that doesn't have a competitive workforce and thus a competitive economy. So, I mean, I would have argued today, I don't know what they would in 2000, that making the hard decisions of rank ordering, and there's a lot of political tension around those. We have research universities, highly competitive research universities that depend on excellence in their faculty to be research competitive. But my point is sustainability over time. If we don't have completions, and I think the discussion today has pointed out not only just completions, but the right completions or the right mix of completions to have a competitive economy, we can't sustain those two. So that would be a comment. If we get to laying things out, we ought to have a robust discussion on whether we need to rank order those.
Mr. Chairman, can I
I'm sorry.
Oh, I just wanted to present one little perspective that even though those were not ranked, I think if you look at what we defaulted to, like the recommended high school curriculum was the default, that in essence, if you looked at the volunteer and staff time both here with the institutions of higher education, I would say that at least 75% of resources available were allocated to participation and success, and the other 25% to excellence in research. So I know Laurie chaired participation and success. I chaired it. I mean, we just, David, if I'm off base.
That's exactly pretty much what I wanted to say, that perhaps it could have been made clear, but the understanding at the time of the committee was that there had been primarily a focus on participation. In fact, it had been called access before, but really access doesn't mean people are really participating. So there's a lot of even nuance in terms of which words you choose, but there was no point in people participating in higher education if they didn't succeed, if they didn't actually get a credential. And there was no point in getting a credential unless we worked increasingly towards better and better programs that they were in. So there was this succession, and so I think some of what you're saying is possible the committee could place, additional emphases on some areas, such as more direct connection to the workforce. But I think it's the same idea, is that you can't do one of these things and be successful. You've got to have the package, and then you don't really need to focus on those things which we're doing reasonably well at, but which ones are going to make the most difference. That's why it's sort of a strategic plan.
At the end of the day, David, the difference between success, which probably has a broad definition of what people believe is success, and completion, which I think is more narrowly defined. I mean, you actually got your degree. I know success meant to say that, but I mean, just those little nuances to really focuses on what are we trying to achieve? What must we achieve as a state like that? Okay.
I think you have a decision point at this level if you want, in that, we had a discussion where you could talk about where you wanted to be as a state over lunch. You could do that. It could be, you've heard a lot of information right now. The committee may have some thoughts on that, or if you wanted, you could go into the next section and combine this luncheon discussion with the discussion at the end of the day, which is really getting at sort of what are your thoughts after hearing everything today? Where would you like to go, and even what kinds of additional data would you like?
I think that makes sense to me.
Okay.
Yeah. So we'll move the noon discussion on where do we want to be as a state to the 1 o'clock. How should higher education contribute? Yeah. That'll take us to 12:30 and the overview of continuous improvement, innovation in Texas higher education. So you have those slides up.
A two-part mission. One was to begin to explore measurable goals for the next long-range strategic plan for higher education. And that's, I think, the critical part of their work for this committee. They also wanted to discuss how to promote a cultural change on the campuses in terms of embracing continuous improvement and improving productivity and efficiency. The council meeting themes were essentially the charges. They had one meeting on something you were just talking about, international competitiveness in higher education. We had a representative from OECD at that meeting, and we have recordings of that for any of you who would like to see it. A meeting focused on student success. They focused on workforce, cost efficiency. They began to think about, sort of, for the lack of anything better, moving forward beyond closing the gaps. I think you can see these. There's this sort of bifurcated mission of the committee. In terms of international competitiveness and student success,
David, let me do this one because
okay.
this is one I presented on at that time. We've already talked about a good bit of this, and Susan had up the one of the charts before, and we've got others. And I think we ought to look at some of these committee meetings and see what data would be relevant to this committee. And the point is here is since closing the gaps in 2000, I mean, the OECD, which is an organization that represents the developed countries of the world, there's about 31 or 32 that the U.S., although it's headquartered in Paris, which turns some people off, the U.S. funds over 40% of their budget. So they are kind of the leading think, if you want to think of the developed world, think tank of the developed world. They've helped develop these standards in terms of workforces. They benchmark all the countries. They have helped set a goal of 60% of your workforce, of your 25 to 64-year-olds that would have some type of higher education credential, whether it could be a certificate of value, an associate degree, or higher. The United States has adopted that. The President and the Department of Education have adopted a goal of 60%. I think more reasonably to be measured against the 25 to 34-year-olds. And as we talked about early, Texas is about 32. If the 25 to 34-year-olds were about 32.5%, but that number is lower. So when we think about how do we close the gap between 32.5 and 60%, there's not much confidence in the sense that of what the demographics we've talked about, the pipeline that we've talked about, and the fact that we've tipped over into that point where we're now becoming less educated, as Dr. Murdoch pointed out. The best work done on new job and the needs has been at Georgetown, and Tony Cardavelli presented to us and by webcast. And his best numbers today is about 63% of the new jobs that are going to be created by 2018 will require some type of higher education attainment, completion. And so, and I think that's the gold standard right now is coming out of his research and his organization. So from a benchmarking standpoint, that's our dilemma. At a state at 32%, with a pipeline that's at 20%, and a demographic that is working against even those numbers. In other words, that demographic, if we just stand still, those numbers are going to get worse. In other words, the pipeline number will go down, and the educated workforce is going to go down unless we close the gap, as I've said at the very beginning, at a rate at least equal. If we close it equally, we could keep it the same. If we can close it faster than the demographic change, maybe we can begin. And I think Dr. Murdoch, if you remember, had some numbers in there that if we actually totally close the gap, our income level is double what it would otherwise be, and what it would otherwise be is going, if we don't do that, will be an outright decline in income. So that was really the discussion that we had about. There was some Carnabelli's suggestions were that you should even take your completions and try to use your data tracking into what was the actual earnings, what was the compensation that was tied to those jobs. So really connect your demand side. And so the role of higher education is not only a supply sider but in turning out degrees, but as a demand sider and connecting on what those degrees and how are they monetized, and to track that data and those outcomes. So I think that kind of covers our discussion. And I guess the international competitive point, because remember closing the gap was just benchmarked against 10 competitive states, was that our companies that locate here are increasingly world companies that have a choice to locate anywhere in the world. And so, in a sense, we're competing against other locations, not only in other states, but in other countries for those jobs. And so it's truly increasingly an international competition. So it should be relevant to us. I mean, some will argue, don't look at New Zealand because they only got 4 million people. But what about Australia? It's got 24 million people, and it's 44% versus our 32. Or Canada, like Larry mentioned, it's at 56, while we're at 32. Or in Mexico, which is only at 22, but they're closing. I mean, their growth rate looks like this, while we look like this, and you can see an intersection point out there if we don't do something differently. So I think that kind of sums up our discussion. I thought, and then we had, which I missed the meeting on where Dr. Schlechter, I might have the pronunciation a little wrong, presented from the OECD about, and he's kind of the international guru that's helped set these standards.
Yes, in fact, he's recently been promoted.
Okay.
So we were looking ahead to see if, in the event the committee might want to hear from him, where we might have to find someone else because he's even higher.
Is there a report from this council?
From the OECD?
From whatever this council is,
for the continuous improvement.
Yeah. Is there a report from that?
Not a specific report. We have various outcomes. So you'll hear a little bit about sort of what they thought a first pass at goals might be. We do have reports from everyone who presented to the council, and we can provide you with a list of those reports and everything. In fact, we have by video. So we do have, or we should have Andreas. I believe we still have Andreas's presentation, even though he was in Paris when he made it, and you'll be able to see him and hear questions to him. So any of that, we plan on using whatever is available. Related to that, I should say we're actually having a couple of one-day seminars. We had one just about 2 weeks ago on what's the purpose of higher education, given some of the questions that have come up related to the workforce. Is higher education worth it? Where we had some individuals sort of, you had Carol Schneider sort of taking one side in terms of what's a liberal education. That doesn't mean liberal arts, versus Mark Schneider, who's from AIR, who is really all about what's your first job salary. So there will be a report coming out of that group summarizing what everyone said without taking a direction that will be made available to you. We'll be having a second one this summer, which we will invite you to, which is about delivery systems and what all of this means and where does it really play in or not. But again, a forum for people to just talk about things and not it's not being guided by the coordinating board. Other than, by the way, these dollars were provided by the Houston Endowment, and these have been the first meeting we think was very successful and well attended. So we have a number of things going on we're going to make available to you. We've got Rand doing some workforce analyses for a couple of different pieces of legislation. When that's ready, we'll make it available to you. So we're making sure that everything we have is at your demand, and there may be additional things you want done, but we're going to take advantage of everything that already exists and is current. So, is that a roundabout answer to your question?
David, why don't you continue?
Well, we were just talking about workforce, and one thing that was going on nationally, is just what I was mentioning. There's a discussion about whether higher education is worth it or not. They're talking about the high debt loads. I always mention one. I've heard the same graduate of NYU with a $200,000 debt and a degree in religion was mentioned in many national articles. So there's the idea amongst some that a degree should be directly related to a job, and we know, at least historically, that while that's true in some cases, it usually spins off in a different direction a short time later. So we want to look at that. There's a lot of data. We want you to know that in Texas, we're not going to see $200,000 debt for a person graduating with an undergraduate degree, whether a certificate or a baccalaureate or an associate. It's more likely to be $26,000 to $28,000. The UT system has just put out a very good website for the UT schools using our data that we combine with the Texas Workforce Commission that shows that. So if you're looking at $28,000 debt and $45,000 starting salary, it looks a lot different than a $200,000 debt and a $45,000 salary. But information for students. We're looking at various ways to work with our records to get more information on this. We've developed an increasingly close relationship with the Workforce Commission. But we need to get more information. What is not available in any state that we can find is, if someone's employed, you don't know if they're employed in the field in which they received their degree. So, for example, if somebody graduated from Laredo with a degree in some IT area and they came to work here, we would know they came to work here, but we wouldn't know if they were working in our information services area and they were actually employing that degree. That's a real shortfall nationally in terms of how people, what type of jobs people are getting. So since that time, we actually have looked out at 10 years in terms of data to look at differences in terms of fields and in terms of those initial jobs versus longer term, and we know historically certain majors the starting job salaries are lower, but they tend to build after 5 to 10 years. So we're doing more with that. The committee talked about adding incentives to graduate within 4 to 5 years. We know that all students can't do that. One thing that wasn't addressed directly in the committee, but we hear a lot, is about all the non-traditional students in higher education. We would posit that the non-traditional students are the students now and have been for the most part in most institutions for 30 years. We need to know how to address their needs and do the most we can to help them graduate in as soon a period as possible. We know from our data that the longer they take to graduate, the more they spend to graduate. It's just true. And so we're going to always have students who graduate in a long time. Anecdotally, I had a woman who was 60 that graduated the same time I did, and when she was 61, she had her master's degree, but she didn't fully, she had spent 40 years, but she didn't fully get the economic benefits of that degree. So that's going to be a reality. So these are things that they wanted to talk about. They wanted to add some, is that the wrong way? Sorry. They talked about adding some metrics for cost efficiencies and productivity, which looked at the range, not just the average of out-of-pocket student cost per degree. We have some summaries for these meetings. I think it'd be useful to give them to you as you asked for particular meetings, because it would be hard to get into all the discussion in a short period of time. But people were mainly concerned with how well the dollars are being spent. Right now we have something called Grad Texas, in which we're trying to get at the thousands and thousands of students who have completed significant hours, in most cases 90 semester credit hours, and have not received a degree anywhere to help them finish their degree. That's a huge investment by the state, a larger investment many times by the students. And as was mentioned earlier, hours alone doesn't lead to the same economic benefits. So we we need to be more aware of that. Lee Holcomb, who was with our Policy Institute, was trying to look at some issues in terms of citations, patents, and various things from a productivity on the side that wasn't strictly educational. As someone who worked with research grants for a number of years here, I think people often forget that there are always students behind this research. And I know when we had significant dollars for the Advanced Research, Advanced Technology program, we found that half of the students supported by those grants were actually undergraduates. And in fact, Norm Hackerman believed that was one of the best means of intellectual property transfer, was those undergraduates who worked on research but went directly into the workforce and didn't go on to higher education. Our chair of the board at the time, his real passion was developing a culture of continuous improvement. How to use the information institutions had to become more and more aware of efficiencies, that perhaps there needed to be an annual conference for institutional representatives to share their ideas for innovation performance measurements. One thing that I think was important that came out of the council was there are a lot of things going on in the institutions that are really improving efficiencies, and there's a great awareness of this. And frankly, we have more graduates even in a time of depressed resources, and the question is, can that go on any longer? Have we gone as far as we can with the current efficiencies?
And David, let me comment on, because there's a previous committee on the cost efficiencies that it did issue a report and led into the continuous improvement. I think there was a little tension around the approach, what I'd say kind of two ways to get there. And one is trying to mandate specific cost efficiencies or ways to improve productivity in terms of educational outputs. The other one was really more of a cultural change, or try to induce a cultural change by the state essentially laying out their goals and taking their dollars as the largest funder of higher education and attaching them to those goals. For example, this is more of an approach to performance, what would be called performance funding, paying for completions instead of participation in some way. So in other words, trying to create a culture that says you're going to be paid by your outcomes, which essentially could create a continuous improvement culture, because you're constantly trying to get more efficient, because if you don't, your costs are going to exceed your revenues. So that's kind of the tension there was between kind of that approach and constantly looking for new ways to be more efficient and keeping to either mandate that or deliver those ideas to the institution. So to me, there's tension between those approaches, and I think that discussion was kind of ongoing in both of these committees over their lifespan.
I think that's exactly right, and I think there's a need to be cautious, and sometimes there's an assumption that there are no efforts going on at the institutions. And one thing that came out through the committee, I think, was that in fact there were efforts. There would be disagreement as to whether they were sufficient. We had a previous cost efficiency committee that one of the desires was that so many students every semester be taking courses online. Well, I asked for some data to be done about a year ago now, and we had, almost 400,000 students in the spring semester were taking at least one course online. So we think about this as sort of a new area still, but there are a significant number of students who are taking courses online. As a matter of course, they may be full-time students on campus. I've met a number of students at UT Austin that are full-time but taking a course online at ACC or somewhere else. So one thing we have to be cautious about is to make sure that the world is really what we think it is at that time. And so we've had a lot of movement in that area. We've got some other things going on. We know about it. A year ago, MOOCs were the hottest thing out there, and there's sort of in a way, a recentering in terms of what do they really mean, how can we really use them well. So there's a lot to learn, but I think there's a lot of change going on. Even I can tell you myself, when I first started teaching a course a year at UT Austin, I was really surprised how this old technology of email makes a difference. And my worries about being an adjunct in terms of being in contact with a student had changed because I was, sharing messages at 11, 12 at night with students. So there are a lot of things that are going on that people take for granted and they don't even mention. And that was a very unsophisticated way, given the technology available, of my interacting with students outside the classroom. So we have to be well aware of all of these things going on. And I think you're in a good position to do that and take best advantage of it. Yes, Laurie.
David, is there any real data, or is it mainly anecdotal, as whether it's from the workforce or whether it's from universities or community colleges themselves, that has shown any movement of the needle of the maybe nimbleness, I guess, of courses offered and degrees offered that directly align with jobs? Example would be UT Tyler and their partnership with an engineering degree from Houston Community College, and then I believe I don't know if it's Southmost or South Texas College, but somewhere in the south part of the state, where instead of universities saying, here are the degrees offered, that instead the workforce dictates it, saying this is what we need. It's my observation that community colleges have been very attentive to that as they've kind of redesigned what they're going to look like. But is there any data, or is it just they're just kind of sort of doing it?
Susan may want to add something. I can say that I don't know of data that's been directly collected. I don't know that it's true, but there's some unevenness. I know, as long as I can remember, many community colleges have reacted very quickly to local needs. I know of in the last couple of years where some have not. In terms of construction management was a large demand. Most have, a few haven't. I don't know why. I know there are instances where universities as well. There was in the Dallas-Fort Worth area a program with a nuclear plant that was created specifically. We don't always know about those because there will be cases where there probably are things going on directly between UT Austin and 3M, which is located here, or Applied Materials with some special gradations. I know when Applied Materials first came here, they wanted everyone on the assembly line to have a baccalaureate degree. They couldn't find enough baccalaureate degrees locally, and so they worked with ACC and said, well, we can get the same thing out of students with associates. They wanted that ability to make decisions on the line that a more educated student would provide, and they found that ACC's program that they developed together did a very good job of doing that. So I think there can be more nimbleness. I think there's a fine line between producing a program very quickly for a new company in versus a company that has 2 or 3 tweaks that they want just for their employees versus another company that essentially hires the same type of people, and those are a little bit harder to specifically define a degree for, say, this insurance company versus that insurance company versus another. And
I think Shirley will remember that in Galena Park, for example, the whole east end part of Houston, through their Chamber of Commerce, directly was impacted and then impacted the community college and universities there from the workforce of the port and NASA. And things shifted dramatically, and it seems to me that, and I remember Schlumberger said, see these people right here, I could hire 350 more of them tomorrow, and ITT answered that cause and shifted their degree offerings.
As did Toyota, Cisco, and let's see, there was another major one, and the manufacturing firm that opened, and they came in and said, here are the skills we need, and we will help you do OJT, but we need these basic skills, and it was a great partnership. That's happening everywhere.
Yeah, we actually did that at Northeast Texas Community College. Basically, there's industry up there that need people that are educated to actually operate the machines in their industry. They can't find them. You have to have specialized training, and they've actually helped pay for the programs. Every person who graduates from the program, has a $60,000, $70,000 job. There's something to be said for liberal education, but there's also something to be said for having a job when you have a certificate. So I think that's happened a lot.
Well, Daimler Chrysler had a program too for auto mechanics, and those high school kids, I remember asking, well, how many of those kids dropped out of high school? And they said 0, because they would graduate and then get a job. This was 10 years ago, $60,000 a year, and then they'd do some sort of loan forgiveness if they went on to college.
Yeah, you'd never think NTCC did a program with Carroll Shelby, and before he died, he gave some money, and his foundation still does, to train mechanics. And every one of those, we have people come from all over the country to the Carroll Shelby, Automotive Institute, and it's just finding those things. Industry's interested in that, in finding ways to have people that can actually operate the things that they need.
I wish I could define more clearly, but Carol Schneider, when she talked about liberal education, didn't mean a liberal arts education. And I'll see if I can find you some information on that. But she was talking about developing the ability to actually have some flexibility in terms of going into a job and learning to do new things, and not just specifically what you're trained to do, which can be a difficulty for some students. And we know that in some technical programs, one of the largest drives is to develop some management skills, and including those some things that would be within a liberal education versus a liberal arts education. I'll see if I can find something, because I never really heard anyone make that specific distinction before, but I think it's an important one.
One other point that came out of our committees, and I'll turn it back to David, was in Texas today, 100,000 of state and tuition resources will buy you 1.8 degrees. National average is 1.9. But when you decompose, and Florida and Colorado are at 3 for 100,000 there, they get 3 degrees. But when you decompose the numbers, our public research universities and our public universities are above the national average, but our community colleges are below. And so the point that's coming out of that is you can actually buy more degrees by spending the dollars in our 4-year universities than you can in your community colleges. And it's not because the universities, because they obviously are not less expensive, it's because their completion rate is higher. So it's that 1 out of every 6 that graduates versus 60% that graduate actually puts you in a situation where it's a lower cost investment for more time and a higher level degree. And that's a dilemma that not only we have as a state, but the country has. But it points out, from a continuous improvement or productivity, we need to change our mindset and think in terms not of full-time equivalent students and what the cost is per student, but what is the cost per completion, because that then takes in the productivity of the institution to actually get the student from just being a participant to being a completer. And so that, to me, that was an important point that came out of our discussion.
And I somewhat agree with that. I mean, but of course, you'll talk to community college presidents, and what they'll say is that it's open enrollment. I mean, anybody who wants to comes, and there are no. So there are a lot of people who go that for one reason or another just stop because they had to make a living or some such. So that's somewhat of a dilemma for community colleges. When you think about completion rates because of the open enrollment dilemma that they have.
Well, that's a state resource decision on participation, at least in my view, participation versus completion. You can't get completion if you don't have participation, but if you have participation without completion, you have spent state resources and you didn't get to your goal. So.
The community colleges are a special challenge in terms of that kind of measurement. I was surprised when I discovered a number of years ago that Texas was the only the only state that really accounts for certificates, and we have been for many years. And now there's a pressure to do that. I should make a point that I believe at least the Community College Association and its Texas Success Council are talking a lot more about completion of the associate degree before moving to universities. If you do that, but you still have the issue of those employees who come there essentially for continuing education to develop a skill or two. In fact, we take advantage of community colleges, ACC for, say, if we need, in some cases, to develop a new skill in terms of some software. We will use, ACC, and they would not be. Those people wouldn't be included in the typical cohorts because they're not a first-time in college student. So, but we're aware of that, and you do have to take into account the resources. I know California at one time actually considered charging students who already had a degree that went to a community college, the full rate of attendance. They didn't go through with that, but there is an issue of limited resources, and you want to give students a chance who are there. They haven't had a chance before. So that there are a lot of things to discuss. We'd like to move on to the last. Okay, this is sort of the final work of the council. And again, there are a number of things here that they would say, and we would say, it really needs some work. But it was really sort of a jumping off point, and what you do could look exactly like this or totally different from this. And just want to make that clear. If you see at the top, you've heard talking about the educational attainment to the state. The committee was very much interested in having a goal of having at least 60% of Texans will have some type of post-secondary credential by 2030. You see it at the top of the page. We push to have it at the top of the page because it's hard to hold an institution directly accountable for this, because this reflects a number of things. We have a demographer here, so we have in and out migration. You have Texas has benefited a lot from, especially Austin, from people moving in from other states with high educational attainment. It's possible our institutions could do a very poor job of graduating students, and yet we could do well on this. Conversely, it's possible our institutions could be doing a great job of getting graduates through the system, but our economy is bad and they leave to other states. So we think it's a measure. We're talking about the good of the state, but we think the overall measure is hard to hold institutions directly responsible for. We have a first goal, which really is looking at numbers of people that are being employed or enrolled in relevant fields within 6 months of graduating. There are a number of different ways of doing that, but that's really a workforce alignment. The next is alignment really having to do with the 8th grade cohort, which was mentioned earlier. How are we doing in terms of getting students all the way through the system and to some type of college completion? Increasing the percentage of degrees and certificates earned within 100% of the time. We know we would never achieve that, but the more you do, the better off you're doing from a cost efficiency standpoint for both the state and the student. And finally, that elusive category of excellence. And it's hard to measure, but I think you have to be cautious that you're not just producing graduates for the sake of producing graduates, that they're doing meaningful work. They're learning to, in some cases, be directly employable. They're learning to be productive. We still think there's some importance to being an informed citizen, participating in public affairs. That I don't think we can ignore that. But this is where they started, and I don't know where you stand, Mr. Hunt. This might be a good time we were going to talk a little bit at lunch about where would they like to be as a state in 2030. This might be a good point to get some discussion on that. We have half an hour.
We have half an hour left, yeah. So I'd like to open it up to, I think there's been a lot of comments about what's kind of where we are. Now maybe we need to talk about is 60%, which once again, that's an international standard in the developed countries. Only one country, Korea, is actually meeting that standard. Japan and Canada are close. They're 57, 56%. And once again, that's at the 25 to 34. That's not the total population. I have also thought whether an absolute number is the right measure, and this is just kind of me, as opposed to a relative standard. In other words, which is not too much different than what the coordinating board did in closing the gaps, where you pick 10 states. Here we could pick 10 countries or a combination of countries and states and just say we want to be Remember, we're number 24 today. We're not number 3. So hopefully we'd set a target higher. But I mean, as an alternative to 60%, we could say we'd like to be in the top 15 as a goal. That probably means we're going to have to get to 60% because you've already got a number that are in the high 40s to the mid 60s. So I just throw that out as a possibility. But let's go back, and I'll digress back to the 60% is the gold standard today. But once again, we're 32% in that age category, and it's declining. So in our pipeline, we went over the pipeline numbers. We broke those down, and once again, the pipeline, which is the coordinating board data with the Houston endowment grant, shows that, and there's no growth in the Anglo population. All the growth is minority, and most of that is Hispanic, and that number is 11%. That after 6 years after high school, after 8th graders given 4 years to go through high school, another 6 years to get any kind of attainment, even a certificate that's monetizable, only 11% meet that standard.
And I think it's important to point out also that it's a little over 9% for economically disadvantaged.
Yes, and if you take the next step and you look at economically disadvantaged, that number it's 9%. And if you take a gender breakdown, the female might go to Hispanic or African American might go to 13%, and the male's down there at 7 or 8 or 9%. So, I mean, we have a gender challenge. We have within an ethnicity challenge that is unique, at least as all of the other states. We're number 1 in the diversity and in our concentration in what we could call lower performing, at least in the sense of higher education attainment. For many reasons, and I mean, whether discriminatory, historical, they are what they are. And so it's a policy issue. I mean, at least in my view, we have to have policies that are better than anybody else because we have a problem that's bigger. And we have to seriously consider, if we're willing to adopt policies, are we ready to invest the money in those policies to really make a difference? And, so far, for the last 15 years, I mean, the truth is I haven't seen a lot of evidence that the political leadership is willing to step up, be transparent, admit that we have this challenge, that it's endemic and it's only going to get worse, and the interventions are going to be difficult and costly, but we need that leadership to try to move us in a different direction. Yes, Larry.
Well, Woody, to address the question of what you're really asking, the question of how do we start to formulate the goal or the target that we're going to set? I'd just like to argue that we set the target in terms of attainment of credentials and not just attendance. I think I'd like to see us set an attainment standard that is globally competitive, but I'd like to make it believable. I think if it gets too high, people will blow it off, thinking that, well, we'll never get there anyway, and won't produce maximum effort. So I'm not sure what that means. I'm just registering the thought right now. It might make more sense to take a collection of countries and pick some, use that in some way to pick a number rather than a number that only one country in the world is actually reaching right now.
Although I think if we do that, I think we're recognizing we're probably competing for jobs that are going to pay a little bit less. And I don't disagree, because to pick 60% and we're at 32, I mean, is it really going to be believable? But on the other hand, there is a reality. There's a price to pay, or there's a bonus to be won if you can deliver a more educated workforce. And we are where we are, though, and that's the reality.
And we only have 15 years to do it if we're letting 2030 be the end point.
Right. Something that would be helpful to me, I don't know if it would be helpful to anybody else, is a better understanding of a description of credentials. So I have left almost 4 decades in an industry where we are hiring engineers to design multi-billion-dollar gas-fired power plants, and we're trying to hire the welders and pipe fitters to build those plants. So I've heard a lot of discussion about credentials and do we count certificates or not account certificates, and 42% or whatever the number is of jobs are going to need post-high school education. So what would be helpful to me is a better understanding of what do the people that issue those reports, how do they define post-high school or open quote, some close quote college?
For us, we at least have historically included credentials in areas including welding. Certificates including welding. Most other states have not. It's not to say they don't think they're important, but they haven't been counting them in ways that we have. There are different kinds of certificates that some take longer than others.
And David, I know what we've been. But what I mean is, this is a new group. And so how is this group, I mean, if we're talking to each other, what does Jim think credentials mean?
Right.
What do I think? And then when we throw out there is a statewide need for 40-something% of jobs. And
it would be helpful to have that discussion because, one thing that's happened in the last 2 years is we've heard a lot of people say the coordinating board believed everyone should get a bachelor's degree, and that has not been true.
No, and I know this.
And we discovered a lot of people think college does not mean community college. We were sort of stunned to realize that there's some parts of the business community that haven't felt that. And so part of it is, again, making sure you communicate the right thing. And it would be helpful if others want to add into the discussion of what types of things you want to count as successes as well, to make sure we're on the same
I'd just like to
page.
see a kind of a group understanding so that as we go forward and use these terms and make these references, we're reading the same definition in the same dictionary. And I would suggest that at this point in time, probably based on our life experiences, doesn't mean right, doesn't mean wrong, but we're not.
Right. And
Okay.
Kathy, I think one way to get there, and I'll get David's input on this, would be to go back to Carnavelli. I think his answer would be, track the dollars. And I think that's what he told us when we had him before, is listen, if they're certificates of value, which means they're monetizable at a competitive wage, then they count. And if they aren't, they shouldn't count. But that's probably true across the board. I mean, so I don't know whether you would think would he be of help in answering Kathy's question there?
Well, the workforce is not an easy thing to address in a clean-cut way all the time. So one thing Carnevale said that I thought was important was, at least nationally in terms of certificates had a big payoff. The problem was that many women went in certificates that had very low payoff. And so there's still some...
Cosmetology. What did you say was the only profession or Steve did?
Child care, which is very important, but the wages tend to be lower. So there are actually gender differences in terms of...
you just look at it in welders and pipe fitters where they make $100,000 a year, and it's primarily males that get the certificates and the experience and continue up the ladder.
And that's part of the nuance, and you would know more about this, so you might be able to elaborate. But I know I was in a meeting about a year and a half ago in which welders came up, and someone from the Workforce Commission mentioned there were 70,000 unemployed welders. So welders are not all equivalent.
I don't know where I'd love to meet that person and let him bring me even 10 of those 70,000 because I know who will take them.
Well, but the point, and I heard this from, I believe, at another meeting from someone from Exxon on Mobil, is that there really are different levels of welders with different kinds of skills. So my 20-year-old can weld. My 20-year-old 100-pound daughter can weld, but you would not want to hire her because she doesn't have the adequate skills yet, and I think her literature courses wouldn't help much with the rest of it. But but there are these even within these things that are talked about a lot, there's some important differences. And one thing I thought at the time is, in that case, there's at least a significant number of those welders that it would probably help to get some continuing ed from community colleges to take them to that next level where you would want to hire them.
And I'm not trying to define it. I'm just saying that if we're going to have recommendations in a report, and we relate to something in addition to associate's degrees and bachelor's degrees and master's and PhDs, that the committee at least should have an agreed upon definition as part of the basis of that report, or we're really saying different things.
Yeah, I agree with you.
And I'm not trying to tell anybody what it ought to be, but I can tell you right now that we don't have that.
Right. And what I'm trying to add is that one has to be careful with some of those things because, a welder isn't always a welder in the sense of what people want for a job any more than, all nurses are equal, or because they have different skills that they bring to, and they've got different levels of training, and we have to be aware of that. And that's one of the issues that one has in terms of saying we need exactly X number of so-and-so. And in fact, one thing we've asked Rand to try to address, and I'm not sure if they're going to be able to produce it, is it's fairly easy to say what we need next year or even 2 years from now. And there's some things we need almost every year, but it's a little bit harder to say what we may need 4 years from now or 6 years from now. And so these are the type of things that if we build a system that's really connected to the workforce, you have to build in something that makes sure it's up to date and it's current with the workforce.
I think when you start talking about things like that, continuing education, I don't know how that fits into what we're talking about, but it really is important. For example, in the healthcare field, bridge programs that help LVNs become RNs. And then helped RNs get BSNs, and things like that. As they begin moving up. I know that there are some community colleges, and in fact, the system that I work for, East Texas Medical Center, had a program with TJC. There was a bridge program that took LVNs to RNs. And maybe it would, it takes the welder to the higher level or something. So, but I think that if you take nowadays anyway, if you take a person, you give them a certificate and give them a degree, and they stop, they're going to be unemployable at some point. Exactly. So continuing education certainly has something to do with this somewhere.
I don't want it to take us back to square one, but I guess part of the thing is that I'm a little bit worried if we take a criteria. I don't care who said it, because nobody really knows exactly what we're going to need 20 years from now or 10 years from now. There's studies all over the world on this, and it's my expert versus his expert versus her expert. I guess we need to kind of think as a state what it is we want out of higher education. And I don't, we can get into wax and wane on all kinds of philosophical issues, but I think we need to have clearly defined goals from which then we get our metric, rather than take a metric and then try to figure out what it stands for. In other words, I don't know what the right metric is for Texas, but I'm not sure it's the same as it is for Sweden. Simply because there's a whole lot of factors that go into that. And you can take, I hear a lot of things about how uncompetitive we are. I look at a couple of areas like high tech. Does anyone want to argue that we're at a big disadvantage with Google and Apple and et cetera in high tech? Or does anyone want to argue that in gas and oil we're somewhat not competitive? Who is it that we want to be competitive with if we're not doing pretty well in those areas? So I'm not saying we don't need a metric. I just wonder if we need a little bit of discussion, and maybe we just set a meeting that where we decide what it is that we want a metric of. In other words, what do we want our young people to get? And I want them to get a job, but what is a good job for a kid with one type of perspective is different than another kid. But we need to talk through, I think, what it is we want we want to be measuring. Because I'm not sure. I've been in this, like Dr. Faulkner, I've been in this business my whole life. And I've been at very different colleges with very different goals. And I think each of them did certain things well and certain things poorly. But I'm not sure I can say, for example, what's the best metric for Texas A&M and Rice, because they're very different institutions, okay? And we're not talking about Rice, we're talking about, and UT Austin is very different than A&M, maybe less so than it was. But I think maybe we need a discussion of what it is that we want our educational system to be creating when that system's done with a young man or a young woman.
And I guess, Steve, my comments there would be I view our institutions as being a means to an end, and so that we really need, and I think that end, which I keep coming back to, is the competitiveness of our workforce, which ultimately will create the resources to sustain or not sustain those institutions. So it's really looking forward and asking in 2030, what does it take to be a competitive Texas on a world competitive scene? And you pointed out a few areas that we're hyper competitive in today. The question is, in my mind, is what do we have to look like in terms of workforce? And then our institutions obviously are the means to get there. But I think you and Dr. Faulkner both raised some cautionary words about a rush to judgment on picking a number and thinking that that might be a realistic for us. There's one other important data point that I think the committee needs to know is, and David, you could correct me, but I think the number of degrees that we are producing, associate, bachelor's or higher, and certificates, about 180,000 a year. I mean, it's drifted up and maybe it's flattened off a little bit, but it's somewhere in that plus or minus. Yeah. But we're importing new citizens that have associate, bachelor's or higher. We're importing about 90,000 a year. So if you want to look at 180 and 90, it's about 270,000 a year of new Texans that have now hit this attainment level that we're evaluating. My only point is we're getting a third of those that have been educated at somebody else's cost from somewhere else in the world, mostly from other states, obviously. So, and why are they here is because Apple wants to be here, and other companies want to be here, so they are an attractor for those people that have those skills. And so we have a very competitive business environment. We have a growth rate that's been a leader for the country, but that can also turn. And so if it turns, we've got a leverage. We have a very positive leverage today that we're adding to our ability to produce. Just think where we would be on the numbers that we've looked at today if we didn't have those 90,000. And so, yes, sir, Ramon.
We've been talking about global competitiveness, and we talk about Korea, but I can see the USA comparing itself to Korea and some of the other countries. I always compare Texas to the other states, and how are we doing compared to New York or New Jersey or California? And I'm tired of being compared to Mississippi, quite frankly. I'd like to see more of this data comparing our educational levels with those of the other states. That's who we're competing with.
Well, that would be an economic question to answer. If you ask the energy industry, they would probably say they're international. Certainly Apple is international to the extent that they are Google that expands here. They are totally international companies. So I think it's and we might want to take some testimony, or should we just worry about what other states are doing?
Well,
or should we worry about
the rest? I'm talking about the educational levels.
No,
I'm talking about the economic levels.
My argument is that dollars are fungible. They can go anywhere in the world, and the people that control them will send them anywhere in the world to create jobs, to make an investment that will create jobs. And the big differentiator, increasingly so, is the skill level. I mean, Google will, or Apple, which both have done this, will create jobs in China if they can get whatever they want accomplished in China better. And a part of that decision is not only the cost of the labor, but it's also the skill level that's there. So my argument would be, is the lower our educational levels, the lower our wages. And whether it's we're comparing ourselves to the gap that we have today with New York or Minnesota, which is over 20%, To me, I just view, as I said earlier, as income. In other words, we're giving up income whether we're competing against another state or another country. We're giving up income by an educational difference in our workforce versus whoever our competitor is.
Just historically, so you know, at the coordinating board has always looked to the 10 most populous states. It hasn't looked internationally. So in terms of, we've never looked to Mississippi, although other people will compare us to Mississippi. But we always have looked to Florida, California, New York, Illinois as the states that we need to compare ourselves to in the U.S. for U.S. comparisons. And so, in fact, the commissioner will say that our closing the gaps was really about being average. We talked about when we developed it being we're number 2, and that as Dr. Faulkner said, if we were talking about being number 1 at that time, it would have been almost an insurmountable goal. But to be number 2 was extraordinarily challenging in and of itself, and we haven't gotten there either.
With all of our focus on workforce development and STEM and all that, I mean, we have to remember that our universities, our public colleges and universities, they've got a diverse offering of educational opportunities: music, theater, literature, history, government, and and as we proceed, I sure hope we don't lose sight of that.
Jerry, I think that gets back to the qualitative issue that got created earlier. I mean, whether it's STEM, and actually they've got STEAM today, which picks up the arts as a part of STEM. And that should probably be a part of the discussion. It's not just a numbers game. It's also a quality issue on what the outcomes should look like, what the workforce should look like. But you got to remember that closing the gaps did not have a direct connection with the workforce, and so I'm at least trying to argue that we need to have that direct connection, because if you fundamentally look back, as we're a state agency, we're being asked to advise a state agency spending state dollars, and I think you spend state dollars to create public goods, and to me a competitive workforce is a public good. It's a goal, and hopefully we can get political support for a different outcome. To the extent that we don't connect with a public outcome and a public good, and we're spending public money, I think we're less able to build that political support.
And it may be defining what you mean by an outcome. If there are quality aspects of it, then quality of life aspects of it. There's room for more than just welders and engineers.
David, we have an untapped state asset of warm prospects who showed interest in higher ed and didn't complete. Can we do a Texas roundup of those folks and offer them free attainment, either a certificate or a 2-year degree? I mean, wouldn't that be in the best interest of the state?
Actually, you raise I thought I was going to be able to say yes, but as you went on, you added some things which I think are sort of interesting. I mentioned Grad Texas earlier, where we're trying to sort of do a roundup, and one of our problems is actually finding where they are. We've even matched with DPS records trying to get accurate addresses. But part of what you said is a little different in that I think we hadn't thought about the concept of, say they have 90 hours, do they not qualify already for an associate degree somewhere? And we haven't really looked at that, and we could look at that. I mean, I think go back to what Steve said earlier, that the data suggests that just an accumulation of degrees isn't adequate. And the community colleges talk about reverse transfer, but this could be different, because these may well be students who took all their 90-plus hours at a university. How do you address that? But and we haven't talked about doing something that doesn't cost money, although it may not be a lot in some cases. But is there some way to evaluate and bring some credential to somebody who's may have earned them. A number of years ago, I don't recall whether it was Texas Southmost or South Texas College that developed a program to evaluate their transcripts, and they found many students who'd actually completed the requirements for a certificate or a degree and didn't know it, including the person who did the programming, who I asked if it was true, actually went running down the hallway saying, "I'm a graduate," but didn't know that. So I think there may be something in that I don't know if it would fit here, or frankly, we're going to go back and talk about whether you have it in a plan or not. That's an interesting idea.
I like the PR soundbite of, free attainment. We'll hold your hand and get you a certificate if you have less than 30 credit hours, maybe, and if you have more than 30, we'll fund.
And there are institutions that were interested. I was at the Texas State Board of Regents on Friday, and I was approached by one of the institutions afterwards wanting to get more information on students who hadn't finished because they want to actively work to help them finish. We could maybe do the same thing with some community colleges at that associate level, but there's a huge financial commitment from both the state and the individual in those programs, and in many cases it's life events that prevented them from going on and finishing. Other cases it may be.
Woody, can I ask a question?
Can I just make a comment? We started doing that a year ago, David.
Mm-hmm. Well, tell us how you did it, and we'll see if we can help facilitate it.
We can give you some advice on that.
Good. Appreciate it very much. So for a year you've been doing it?
Yes.
Good deal.
We're at closing. I'd like to, Dee, make your comment, and I'd like Dr. Faulkner to have the final, and then we have to close.
Steve, just a quick question. How informed do you think the legislature is on your demographics?
Well,
I mean, if we're going to have political support or legislative support.
I think certainly most of the leadership of various levels, I think, know the basic message. There's some of the younger ones that may not have gotten the full story, but
my firsthand experience in the legislature would lead me to state that they don't get it.
Okay.
The vast majority of the House members don't understand it, and if we're going to have some impact beyond and have the political support, it's going to be critical that this information is disseminated and understood.
Larry.
I actually just wanted to follow up the comment that Jerry made about educational variety and the programs. I think all that's true. I actually do agree that a workforce outcome is an important way to look at what we're doing, but there's more at stake than just the workforce issues. Actually, our stability as a society in Texas ultimately depends on our doing a better job to see that educational attainment is more consistent across the population segments of the state. Just basic justice is also dependent on that. So there's a lot riding on this. In the end, though, it's all a story. I won't say it's all a story, but it's largely a story of educational attainment. It's the target we have to shoot for is to get better educational attainment.
That's right.
And you can look at that from a workforce needs point of view, or you can look at it from a justice point of view. Those are maybe different ways of trying to look at it. I'd like to make one last comment, Woody, before we break, in that I'd also urge that this group go a little bit beyond the normal purview of the Higher Education Coordinating Board and look a little bit at the issues of the high school to college transition. We are that issue right there, that connection point is a major loss point. And in our society and just the way we're organized, the way practically every state's organized, higher education has its piece, and K-12 has its piece, and they spend time pointing at each other across that divide. But that divide is a huge loss point. We need to think a little bit about what advice we can give the state on that loss point.
Yeah, so I think the whole K through 12 connection issue and what we would want to include in our report about college-ready students, and that should be a part at least of one meeting, maybe all of one meeting. So,
and the junior college to senior college is also a loss point.
Right, and we're well represented here at the community college, and so we can. But I think we need to have the dialogue of how do we have a seamless K through 16 system, and the way I've tried to explain it before is how do we incentivize the pipeline, and the pipeline is K through 16, both institutionally and individually. So how do we help guide or incentivize a student to be prepared, and how do we incentivize institutions to help in making prepared, and ultimately knowing that the goal is a completion that is monetizable in our economy, and it's a win-win, everybody wins.
I'm real radical. I'd like to legislate K-14.
Well, Tennessee is just moving toward paying for a community college, expanding to a K through 14 system. So
actually, we call it K-20, PK-20, because we want to go beyond the high school, and that's where your P16 councils come into great play. We can share a lot of news about those.
Everyone should have, and if you can't turn it in today, you have to look at your calendars. But we'd like to have a meeting over the next couple of months, so you should have an April and a May time, three dates in one, and it looks like about 8 choices in May, and we'll try to consolidate, and then we can begin to work the whole year. I think we need to do that so that because people particularly have difficult schedules, they'll know. Yeah, I will. We ought to try to do the whole year. So this gets us started immediately, but over the next 30 days, let's try to explore to find commonality for the whole year.
In fact, if there's some of you that has one day is virtually impossible the whole year, it would be good to know that. We once had a physician that Tuesdays was never going to work because of surgical schedules. So
say that again, David.
If there's some day that consistently will never work, the whole year it would be helpful to know that. And some people have schedules that are like that. Probably most of you, it's probably 4 or 5 days a week that are like that. But.
Yeah, and we might find the second week of the month on a Tuesday or Wednesday if it works, and we don't have anybody that just can't make any of them, because obviously that would exclude him from the meeting. So we'll work on that to see what's best practices. So because I think to be effective here and to stay on pace, we probably need to meet monthly. So, and you and I need to work on an agenda with Larry for the next month, and we need to begin to think who we bring in to present. So that we can do this in the most productive way.
In fact, it would be helpful to think out the next 2 meetings to have some thoughts about that.
Right. And then the question of external consultants as well is something probably needs to be answered earlier than later, because if we bring them too late, it's more difficult to be effective. So, I want to thank the committee today, everyone that was here for your time. We're going to try to keep these on time from 10 to 2, and I appreciate your efforts. I look forward to working with you. Thank you.